And good afternoon, brothers and sisters, for coming back to our symposium. We'll start off with two speakers this afternoon, one talking about the UK experience and the other about the experience in France, following which we will have some question and answer period. And then at 3 o'clock, we will then bring up a brother from the USPS as well as a Canadian researcher to talk about the U.S. experience and some of the research that's being done here in Canada about access to financial facilities. But to really start, I'm going to go a little bit off script and provide a little bit of my personal story in respect of banking in Canada. In 1973, after a first failed attempt to get a university degree, I was hired by the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce in their manager training program. And I found that I was quite successful in that program. Within a short period of time, they had moved me through and trained me in all of the departments of a branch, the tellers through the savings accounts, checking accounts, current accounts sections, as well as branch accounting. And this was in the new Sudbury branch in Sudbury, Ontario, and then in a very short period of time, they moved me to the main branch downtown to continue my training process on a manager's training track. And within a month or two of being there, they gave me a branch as a branch accountant in North Bay, Ontario. And so I worked as the branch accountant not in the main branch there, but in the smaller branch, and then within a year or so, I was transferred to the main branch in Orillia, where I was the branch accountant for the Bank of Commerce in Orillia. And it was around that time that I decided to leave, even though I was on this managerial track towards a CEO position, which is probably a bad career decision at that time, considering what the compensation levels are now. But I decided to leave mostly to take another attempt at getting a university degree, which I was successful at, but also because of the culture within the banking sector among its employees, the labor relations, and I think we've all heard stories about how bad labor relations are within the 5 major banks in Canada. But also it was my experience in the dealing with the customers, or the bank's relationship with their customers. Joe and Jane CUPW, the banks don't really care about. It was only dealing with the major depositors, the ones with large accounts, that the manager and the accountants as well were expected to provide exceptional service to and fall all over. And as far as the working class customers and the middle class customers, they were essentially ignored, or even there was attempts to intimidate those customers. And I think if you're familiar with Stephen Leacock, he's a noted Canadian humorist, wrote a very telling short piece called My Financial Career that talks about a person that wants to open a bank account with one of these major banks and how intimidated he was. And there is the National Film Board has made a short animated piece on my financial career, and you can find it on YouTube. And it's about 6 minutes long, and it's very, very humorous. But it shows just how intimidating these large banking institutions can be. And interestingly enough, the branch that I was managing or the accountant for in Orillia, in the document vault, we were storing the personal papers of Stephen Leacock on behalf of the Stephen Leacock estate and the museum there in Orillia. And I had the opportunity at sometimes when I was burning midnight oil there in the branch to take down a box and read some of Stephen Leacock's papers in his own handwriting. It's a very illuminating and honoring experience that I had that opportunity. But Canadian banks show no deference to the Canadian public, and I think a Canadian postal bank will democratize the delivery of financial institutions in Canada, and that's why I'm really proud of this union for pushing forward with this issue. I'm very honored to be a part of this push, and I also want to send the message that once Canada Post establishes its postal bank, I am more than willing to reignite my banking career and become CEO. So with that, I would like to introduce our first two speakers for this afternoon. Andy Furey is a national officer of the Communications Workers Union of the United Kingdom. And since 2002, Brother Furey has served as a national officer responsible for the post office. And prior to 2002, he served on the postal executive and has since 1993. So his career at the post office, however, began at the young age of 16 when he was hired as a counter clerk in London. And Brother Furey is currently responsible for the postal banking file, as well as many other important files and financial files with the CWU. So I'll turn the podium over to Brother Furey, who will talk about the experience of the UK in the postal banking field.
Thank you very much for that introduction. First of all, may I bring fraternal greetings from the Communication Workers Union of the UK. I must say I'm delighted to be here. Would wish to thank Dennis and the CUPW for this invitation. The Post Office, and in particular providing financial services through a Post Office bank, is an issue very dear to my heart. I found this morning's contributions from the speakers very thought-provoking, and it was a very interesting morning. And I recognised a lot of parallels with what's going on in the UK, but also some subtle differences. I hope that the case study that I'm going to share with you of the UK will help your debate and will also enable you to arrive at policy decisions, because there is lots of different variations on the theme, and certainly I think the UK experience will be seen to be somewhat different from the French experience, which you'll hear shortly, I'm sure about. So my presentation is going to be in two parts. Make no apology for this, that the first part of the presentation is a UK Post Office presentation, which I asked them to provide for us. That will explain to you exactly how the Post Office operates its financial services to the public of the UK. And then the second presentation will be a union CWU presentation about how we feel about things and how we've developed things and progressed things and championed this issue. So if I could ask for the first presentation, sorry, they're the wrong way round. That's the presentation that's shown at the moment. It's the second one. If the first one with the Post Office logo could be put up, please. It's the one that building the UK's leading challenger financial services provider. That's the one. Thank you. Okay, so this is the Post Office's presentation. Three parts to it. The heritage of financial services in the UK and where financial services is today in the UK, and then the vision for the Post Office vision for 2020. Okay, so the Post Office is not new to the world of financial services. The UK Post Office, back as long ago as 1861, established a Post Office savings bank. And I think there's some parallels there with what we heard this morning with the Canadian Post. So originally, the Post Office was somewhere where you could do savings banks and people could invest. Ordinary working class people could invest their savings. And the Post Office has come a long way since then. And now they're offering multi-channeled opportunities for that meets the customer's needs in the modern day. And there's a very positive customer interest in offering an extremely wide range of financial products. And that should give you some illustration of how things have changed. This slide is a fascinating slide in that it gives the recent journey of where the UK Post Office is. So back in 2002, the Post Office established what was called a joint venture with, ironically, the Bank of Ireland. The Bank of Ireland didn't have any outlets in the UK, only had outlets in Ireland, and so they were keen to get a foothold into the UK, and a joint venture was established. And that first joint venture brought about foreign exchange, and the Post Office in 2002 first started doing bureau de change foreign currency. And it had rapid growth based upon a 0% commission. And it now, as of today, is the single biggest provider of bureau de change in the UK. So the Post Office in some 12 years has gone from doing no bureau de change to being the leading outlet in the UK, which is quite phenomenal. Then in 2003, a further joint venture was established with the Bank of Ireland, and it was a fast-growing niche player in the market, and it launched a number of what were determined to be good value products, including instant saver, growth bonds and car insurance. So this needs to be put into context. This was a partnership joint venture with a private bank, the Bank of Ireland, who were established in Ireland, and obviously any profits were shared equally between the Bank of Ireland and the Post Office. So essentially, the Bank of Ireland was using the Post Office outlets to promote financial services, but they were all under the Post Office brand. The Post Office brand being well received, had integrity, one of the best brands in the UK. Then in 2004, the travel insurance product that was traditionally launched with Aon was changed, and the Post Office entered into the market in a real way by launching a Kids Go Free insurance, travel insurance, and that's been extremely successful. So moving on quickly, if you look at the top two icons on the right-hand side, you'll see that in the last 7 years that the Post Office has been voted the best retailer of UK travel money for 7 years in a row from the British Travel Awards Association. And similarly, for the last 8 years, the UK Post Office has been voted the best UK travel insurance provider as well. So, I mean, that gives an indication of how popular these products are. As recently as 2013, the Post Office launched a current account. Now, the CUPW of the UK has been quite critical about how slow they have been to bring about a current account, and it's only being trialled in a small part of the UK in East Anglia. It hasn't been rolled out across the whole UK. So this was quite a significant development where this current account was launched, and there's 3 different types of current account which are aimed at a number of people that are potentially unbanked, people that may not be on big incomes. And also, they introduced the Post Office face-to-face mortgage advisors, and there's 100 of them. I think you heard earlier on this morning from some of the presentation that that in the UK there's something like 300 people in the Post Office that provide financial services. I'll develop how that operates. I know there was lots of questions around training, etc., but we actually have now got something like 100 mortgage specialists that sell face-to-face mortgages. And that was an important development into the market as well. And the mortgage itself is seen to be one of the best providing mortgages in all the comparison tables there is. Moving on, the key growth for the Post Office is that it's got a comprehensive range of products. In savings products alone, it's got a 17 billion book. So 17 billion pounds worth of money has been invested in these various savings accounts, and that's fairly significant. Obviously, there's car and I've spoken about travel insurance, but it's also got leading market products in mortgages and credit cards. And as I said, the current account, the pilot was launched last year. There's also prepaid debit card as well, which obviously helps some of the most disadvantaged people in society. It's as I mentioned earlier, it's become the leading provider in retail foreign currency. It's got actually got 25% market share and award-winning travel money cards. Over and above that, they're also the major traditional payments business in the over-the-counter payments for bill payments. And I was quite amused this morning to hear that in the Canada Post you can't do bill payments across the counter, but you can do them online, and that seems bizarre to me that you can't do them across the counter. I would say that bill payments is your basic activity across the counter other than postal stuffs. There's personal and business banking, and there's 2,308 cash dispensers that are Bank of Ireland cash dispensers across the UK. So it gives you an indication it's quite substantial, the activities there. Moving on, the financial services that are offered today, as I mentioned, are through a third-party provider, Bank of Ireland. It's been a partnership for just over 10 years. I think these figures are quite significant. In 12-13, the financial services business for the UK Post Office delivered 281 million in revenue. And to give you an idea, that the total revenue for the Post Office is about £1 billion. So that gives you an idea. It's about 28% of total income is linked to financial services. But crucially, the increase on the previous year was actually 6.4%. So against, in a world situation where there's been the depression as such, and we've seen the problems with financial markets across the world, in the UK Post Office in 12-13, there was an increase of 6.4%. Now, obviously, this is all good in terms of protecting jobs, protecting the post offices. We spoke about the 100 mortgages specialists that have been rolled out last year. And that's important because obviously they have to operate in a regulated market, and they have to be properly trained. We've also got a further 250 financial specialists. They're CWU members. They work in the main Crown post offices. And to put that into context, our network is made up of sub-post offices that are run privately and Crown post offices. Our Crown post offices are about 350 across the UK, but they do something like 20% of volume and traffic. In those 350 Crown post offices, we will have 250 financial specialists whose job is to engage with the public and sell, have sales conversations and sell to the public financial services. Now, that doesn't mean that the rest of the counter staff don't get involved in financial services. They do, but the financial specialists are the ones that are trained specifically to deal with that job day in, day out. In circa 2,000 branches, there will be staff that have a limited client conversation and can complete non-regulated sales. So some financial services are regulated and some are not. And then obviously in the rest of the post offices, there'll be leaflets and refer leads to contact centres and other channels as well. So this is the post office's vision for 2020. So this is the UK Post Office's vision. It wants to be a leading challenger in the financial services market. It wants to have a brand that's trusted by customers to deliver products and services that meet the customer's needs. And critically, and the CWU support this, that they should provide customer value, should be transparent, fair, and give good value for money services. And with, of course, the widest access, and that's all channels that's necessary for that to happen. Sorry about this slide's a bit busy, but this just gives you an indication of their vision and how they're transitioning from a transaction-based current post office to more a customer-focused business. But it's about building the sales model, offering unrivaled access, broadening the customer, and effectively delivering products that are transparent, fair, and offer value for money. And you'll see at the bottom there, the bottom rectangle, they want to build skills of our members through having a financial specialist academy, supporting a professional organisation, which will obviously extend career opportunities and give people a chance to earn more money and have greater job satisfaction. So, I mean, this is ambitious. It's got an ambition for the future, which the CW supports. That currently, there's a massive advertising campaign going on in the UK. Every major TV channel that covers commercials has got adverts. It's about broadening the financial services brand across the UK. It's integrated across all channels. It's about delivering a strong message about awareness and credibility. And it's a direct response. The campaigns are running alongside to support various products. So it's advertising financial services as a service provider, but then having specialised adverts for mortgages, savings, credit cards, home insurance, etc. And there's a positive effect for this. So the advertising is not just on TVs; they're in bus shelters, billboards, anywhere you go, you can see advertising going on for the post office. Okay, and some of the recent awards, I've spoken about the foreign exchange and the travel. You'll see there also that in 2013, they won the Watt Mortgage Award for the winner, and that's quite prestigious, as the best fixed rate mortgage provider, and the best lender website as well, because a lot of the financial services are done online as well. And yourmoney.com, they were the best Money Direct Awards for 2013 for savings accounts and life assurance and the overall direct provider. And then you see that the moneynet.com, that they were the most consistent fixed rate bond provider with a triple gold awards in 2011, 12 and 13. So the UK Post Office, in terms of providing financial services, is actually seen to be very successful and is on an upward trend. And obviously our members are delivering that. So in summary, financial services is a key growth sector for the Post Office, the UK Post Office. There is strong consumer interest in the services, the financial products that the Post Office are offering. And the Post Office actually is investing in people, in training, developing people, developing its capability. And it's the key foundation blocks are in place through this joint venture. And it's also dealing with the regulatory environment where it has to deal with the opportunities, well, the opportunities are good, but also challenges as well. And it just gives you an indication, I don't know if you can see that well or not, but gives you an indication of the different services, financial services that are on offer across the UK Post Office as it stands today. So that you've got one box with savings, and there's a lot of different savings there. Different box with travel. Then on the far right, you've got the payment services with your bill payments and your various clubs. And then you've got on the bottom right, you've got your Post Office insurance, and you can see virtually every insurance you can think of you can get from the UK Post Office. And in the middle is the mortgages, the ATMs, the credit cards and the postal loans, etc. So that will tell you that's a significant amount of different products that you can get across the UK Post Office. If I can move on to the next part of the presentation, which is the CUPW presentation. It's not in colour, but hopefully it'll be just as interesting. So if we can move to the next slide presentation, please. Okay, so this presentation should say it's not to Canada Post, it should say it's to the CUPW, but apologies for that. So this is financial services in the UK. Okay, just to get the summary will just be just a background. Financial services that are available, the share that they've got of the revenue, the concerns about reliance on mail revenue. We'll talk about how the Post Office interfaces with Royal Mail, future plans. Okay. You may be surprised to learn that actual fact the UK Post Office is totally separate from the UK Royal Mail. The UK Royal Mail was privatised last year, and thank you for exporting Moya Green to the UK, comrades. Yeah, very, very, very pleasant of you to have done that. Yeah, so the Postal Services Act legislated for a separation of Royal Mail and the Post Office. So Royal Mail was privatised. We'd beaten off privatisation over 20 years. We managed to beat off Thatcher and various other governments that wanted to privatise, including the last Labour government that was looking to privatise Royal Mail. Unfortunately, the coalition government of Conservatives and Lib Dems pushed forward the privatisation, so that took place last year. However, the Post Office has remained in public ownership, and the current government is seeking to move it towards a mutualisation. So this is the only country in the world that has separated the Post Office away from its mails and parcels and letters. And that's quite a worrying thing to have happened. And I think all unions across the world need to look to that to try and avoid that happening, because obviously there's a synergy between the post office and the mails and the parcels. So in 2012, Post Office ceased to be a subsidiary of Royal Mail, operated independently, and now it's totally split. And as of October last year, 60% of Royal Mail was sold on the London Stock Exchange, and now Royal Mail's a FTSE top 100 company, and Moya Green's making lots of profit on the backs of our members, and no doubt is getting lots of bonuses as well. So, financial services available in the Post Office. We spoke about the comprehensive range. Sorry if there's some repetition here, but I think it's worth to have this for emphasis. The current contract with the Bank of Ireland runs to 2023. So there's nearly another 9 years to go where the Bank of Ireland will have access to post offices across the UK. And one of our problems is that we've been seeking to get a proper post office people's bank run by the post office, where the post office would get all the profits rather than sharing it with the Bank of Ireland. The problem here is that to get rid of the Bank of Ireland, you'd have to pay them a lot of money to go away. So, I mean, this is one of the difficulties of trying to get a genuine, real people's post office bank, which we used to have many years ago in what was called Gyrobank in the UK. Gyrobank was the 6th biggest bank in the UK, and Margaret Thatcher privatised it and sold it to Alliance and Leicester, and now it's part of the Santander Group. So traditionally the post office has had a bank called Gyrobank, but unfortunately no longer. And I was interested to hear the figures that were mentioned this morning, and the split between your private sub-post offices, well, we call them sub-post offices, but post offices, and the ones that are directly managed or run by the company. In the UK, we've got 11,780 post offices. It is the largest retail network in the whole of the UK. All of the banks add together can't get anywhere near 11,780. And very similar story to what I've heard this morning. Banks have been pulling out of rural areas, been closing their outlets. The post office has also been closing outlets, and I mean, to give you some indication, 20 years ago that we would have had 20,000 outlets across the UK. So there has been a significant reduction. But as it stands today, it is the largest retail network in the UK. As it says, it offers convenient and accessible banking service to everyone, particularly those in rural locations. The recent growth plan's been introduced. What you can do is virtually every bank account in the UK, you can walk into a post office with your debit account card and draw money from the automated system. So, you know, everybody can access the post office for money through every major high street bank by just going into the post office, which is HSBC was the last one to come on board, and First Direct. But so 95% of the UK debit card holders can access their money from the post office, and that's massive. In that wherever you go, you can get in those 11,780 post offices, you can draw money from it. Financial services, we've been through this, but you know, there's also MoneyGram on there. There's also the National Savings and Investment through premium bonds, and I'm sure you'll recognise some synergies with these with Canada Post as well. Automated bill payments, pay stations, etc. Charging for electricity smart cards. So a whole range of different services. So through our lobbying and campaigning, we've got the government and the post office to identify financial services as a key area to move into. But also we want the post office to be the front office of government, and this is vitally important. And the statistics here, you heard that, I think the slide that was shown this morning said there was 25% of the income from the post office is through financial services. It's actually 27.4 now. And although whilst that's a significant part of its income, it actually hasn't gone up much since 2004-05. It's still, it was 26.1%. But the growth last year was important. Interestingly enough, that despite there being a decline in mails volumes, the post office's part of that revenue has gone to 40% compared to 27.8 in 2004-05. So there's a lot more eBayers, a lot more parcels, a lot more packets being done across the counters. And this gives you an indication of what the post office does overall. As you can see, 40% of that is from mails, which is the big chunk, but there's also government services there and financial services and others as well. That's revenue streams for 2012-13. And concerns about the future. In 2012, Royal Mail and the Post Office incredibly signed a 10-year commercial agreement that Royal Mail products and services will be accessed across Post Office counters. So we're 2 years into that 10-year agreement. We lobbied government, we campaigned with government to get a long agreement. Our concerns were that a privatised Royal Mail would then look to take their services elsewhere to the big supermarkets, the big 24-hour supermarkets on the outside of towns. So they have got the ability to reopen. There's reopener clauses, and if commercial circumstances change, it can be reviewed after 5 years. Our concern now is that the Post Office's reliance on mails, as you saw, was 40%. If Moya Green and Royal Mail decide to open up other outlets, or even open up their own outlets, and you had Royal Mail outlets operating like a post office, then that could put at risk the cost effectiveness of products, and the post office will be at risk overall. So the whole separation and then the dividing and privatisation of Royal Mail and keeping the post office in government owned it does cause lots of tensions and lots of problems. Okay, so the future plans, despite the government and the post office recognising that there's a potential for growth, we think that they're not moving forward quick enough. We're critical of the pace of change, and we're critical that they're not moving into accounts like children's accounts and business banking. And we work in partnership with the Federation of Small Businesses to promote businesses being able to access post offices through banking services. The current account we've discussed, but it's being trialled and it hasn't been extended across the whole UK yet. And as I said, there's little progress towards the long-promised development. Our concern is, I mean, and I was being critical here, we don't think that the Bank of Ireland's ambitions match the CW's ambitions, and we're not sure that the Bank of Ireland's a big enough bank to be able to deliver what we want the post office to deliver. So we're not actually impressed with them as a service provider. The problem is they've got a contract till 2023 before, and so what we're pushing the post office hard is to actually get the Bank of Ireland to deliver more products, more services, so that the public have got greater choice, and we can reach out to all parts of society to come into post offices. So we're going to we'll continue to make the case urgently that to boost financial services of the post office, because we think it's vitally important for a secure and secure post office of the future. Happy to answer any questions. Thanks very much for listening to us.
Thank you. Okay, thanks very much, Andy, for that most informative presentations. Our next speaker is Nicolas Galepides, is the General Secretary of the SUD in France, and has been the General Secretary since 2010. He began his work with La Poste in 1980 as a sorter, and he transferred to the Banque Postal in 1998. So he'll enlighten us on the experience in France. So thank you, Nicolas.
Merci. Bonjour. Hello. Well, there you have my little piggy. I saw that you have your blue piggy and we have a yellow piggy. So I wonder if the directors of the Banque Postal agree with this logo, but I like this one. I think it's a great idea. Firstly, thank you for inviting me. This is a key meeting. It's unique, especially because 15 days ago I was in Chicago, and now I see our USPS brothers and sisters and all the unions here who are in an alliance, which raises the question, the other unions who are also wondering about the future of the postal service and our jobs. The issue is quite current on both sides of the Atlantic, so it's very nice that we should meet and discuss this together. Very quickly, we stand for unity, solidarity, and democracy. We're the third postal union in the telecom sector. And we work as much as we can in order to defend the future of the French Postal Service. But it's not limited to our borders, because we're defending the future of all postal services across the world. We've always had this universal union, and we have to realize that we could make it work. And if there are good postal services on one side, they could be copied by the other side. On the Canada Post side, it's important to see what work can be done simultaneously with the US and North America in general. Now, about my presentation, let me press on the button. Great. The first question is quite odd, i.e., is it possible to have a banking model that would be low cost and which would meet the needs of everybody? Well, the answer is yes. It's not too difficult. This is an argument we often put forward, that all it takes is that you have to step back a bit and try to find out what users can do for the clients for the bank to make a profit. What is the bank's job? Initially, the bank was there to fund the country's economy, small businesses, individuals, and small communities. So what can banks do for the community and for people? The question is not complicated, yet it is essential. It's at the center of what we're talking about today. I walked a bit in the street yesterday, and I saw the big banks' logos. And you don't have to be the biggest to do the best job, as we know. That's the reality. And today we see that small-sized banks, for instance, the Postal Bank, they meet the needs of people better. And the financial services in the UK, the banking financial service provide better services. Better services expected by people than the corporate banks. The question is even more pressing today. As we saw, I don't want to go revisit what happened in 2008. We saw how the world banking system treated people, workers, and the environment, and all that. I lump all that together. We saw what that led to in 2008, and we better not repeat that experience. I'm sorry, but there is a French-English version, and some passages in English could look funny because I didn't really have too much time to go over it. Now, next. On the French Bank Postal, who owns it? That's crucial. We'll see, we'll look at its constitution, and you'll see that the French state is the owner of the postal group in France and of the savings bank. And you'll see that the Caisse de dépôt, the French state owns the Postal Bank under the Caisse de dépôt. There has been a desire to privatize it. We talked about privatization this morning, the desire to privatize postal services in general. The idea has been there in France to privatize the postal service, and it was decided by the Sarkozy government to please the European authorities, because the example of the French public service doesn't sell very well within European institutions, and European lobbies don't like that, and those who are in favor of privatization are against it. So this is how they explained this desire to privatize the French postal service. Initially, the French postal service was supposed to be 25% owned by an external operator. That was the Dutch postal service. And there was a major battle. Isabelle of Force Ouvrière and myself, we worked very hard. We held a referendum to ask people if they agreed or disagreed with the idea of privatizing the French postal service. And it was a major surprise for us. To our greatest surprise, 2.3 million people spontaneously responded, and 99% of them said it was foolish to privatize the French postal service. We did this ourselves. And we can discuss this later. So the issue project, that is to bring in private capital into the postal system, was dropped, and today only public investments are allowed. Hence this connection with the Caisse de dépôt. So the postal group owns the postal bank 100%. On the model, let's go one step lower. And you'll see that there is the postal bank on top. So it's a branch. It's a subsidiary where there are about 3,500 people, the senior management, then the management, and this subsidiary, which is a subsidiary of the Postal Service, gives orders to its corporate headquarters. You have the network with about 55,000 clerks who work 65% of the time for the postal bank, which brings up the question of training. All the clerks can go on the computer and carry out operations, and there are no problems there. There are about 10,000 advisors, that is sales staff, for the postal bank. And in addition to that, you have the financial services, that the back office of the financial bank. And that is the major challenge when you start a bank, because that is the backbone of the bank, the computer operations. And for that, you have about 18,000 employees. Just for the information system, that's where I work when I'm active and when I'm not doing my union job full-time. So here we have a model that is based on service agreements that have lasted since 2005, and we'll talk about what was happening before then, because it could be helpful in understanding the whole situation. Now we have 10.7 million there were 10.7 million active clients in 2013, and there are about 100 billion euros in the bank. And they also have a passbook. We have a savings system, and we have about 20 million people with their passbooks. This will become handy when we talk about accessing banking services. And you can see the operations. For instance, housing loans, credit, consumer loans. And the detail here is that there is a public-private partnership. Consumer credit, this is a subsidiary that is 65% owned by the Postal Bank and 25% by the Société Générale, which is one of the biggest French banks. The same thing for property insurance, and which is 65% owned by the Postal Bank, and also by the a mutual group. This was one of the conditions for the creation of the Postal Bank, that is to create partnerships. So there is asset management, what we were told this morning about the asset management, that is wealth and discretionary management. They're trying to manage people's wealth, and we have to be careful here, because there is this desire to attract clients who have a lot of money, and in that case, you tend to forget the the low-income earners. This is the trend, and they say it's because of the need to survive. But the Postal Bank has been surviving and doing quite well for 150 years. Now, there are new activities. This morning we talked about Dixia's bankruptcy. Now, banks do lend. The Postal Bank lends to communities, to cities, and to provinces and departments. Now, very quickly across the figures there. In Canadian dollars, you can see that I've translated the figures into Canadian dollars. You have sales. I tried to translate, and I hope that you understand. What you need to know here is that on the gross sales, the sales of the French Postal Service is about 21 billion euros. Let's say about 30 billion Canadian dollars, rather. And the operating results. So it's about 1.7 billion Canadian. For the figures, well, I'll add some figures later, and that would give you an idea of the activities of the Postal Bank compared with the Postal Service. Now, let's go back into history very quickly. And you can see that the French Postal Service is quite old. In 1817, services were set up with the money order system. It was really the mail system, a bit like the Pony Express, a postal relay with people who would carry mail and also money. Things have evolved, and then there was the money order system with the the postal the representative being somebody that you trust and you open your door to and you show them your ID and you entrust in them with your key documents and they can take your money. This started in 1817, and then in 1880 there was the creation of the savings system, the equivalent of the Caisse des Jardins or the National Savings System. And for that you needed to educate the people and teach the low-income earners to save money and set money aside. And this was basically the principle of savings that took off. And that was the basis for the creation of the National Savings System. And after the Second World War, there was the possibility of bank checks. So we're getting closer to the bank economic model. You could withdraw money and open an account and write checks. And as I said, there was this partnership between the savings account system and the banks. And there again, the state was there to guarantee the system. As you put your money in, the state was there to back the system up. And up till 2000, there was a possibility of moving into new products with housing loans, so you wouldn't go directly to the bank. And in 2000, things changed. The model changed in that. Well, let me move on to the next page. The question being, where is the money? The mission of the Postal Bank and the banking financial services is written into law. In France, you cannot refuse serving somebody who came to open a bank account, but it is not written anywhere that the Postal Bank has to open an account for anyone who shows up. The only mission they have is to issue a passbook, but that passbook comes with certain services. Today, for instance, we have about 2 million people who depend on those passbooks because that is their only banking connection. For instance, I can get a check and deposit it on my passbook, and I can deposit my salary and my family allowances, and similarly, I can transfer money to pay my electricity bill, my water bill, and I can ask the postal service to draft a check for my telephone bill, to pay my telephone bill and all that. This is important. The passbook system initially was for savings, but it became a kind of wallet for those who don't have a bank account. So the legal mission requires that the Postal Bank must open one of those passbook systems for anybody who has papers, so long as you have ID and an address. And you'll be entitled to a savings bank book, and you have to a euro 50 into the account, and it can never be in an overdraft situation. And there is no commission for check cashing. And that right was granted because, as I said, we have to own a bank account in France because we're paid by check, and it's the Bank of France that can grant that. So basically, when you are rejected by a bank because you're too low income, you don't have enough cash or you don't have enough money, or you have banking problems, you're basically a pariah. Well, you go to the Bank of France and you say, this bank rejected me, and in 90% of the cases, the Bank of France will send you to a postal bank and tell the postal bank to open an account for you. That is a bit of a defect, and there is a debate right now about fair play, because if I refuse opening an account for somebody and the person is sent away, I have to pay for that. In Belgium, for instance, if a bank rejects somebody who comes to open an account, that bank has to pay a fine, and that fine is used to fund that account in a different bank. We'll talk about that later during the question period. So the mission actually goes further, and there is the postal network, which is considerable. There are about 10,000 post offices where there are computer banking systems, and there are 7,000 other contact points, that is relay services in grocery stores And for instance, at the city hall, you have a kiosk with a clerk who can give you services during the week. And that is part of a mission, but the mission is not necessarily written down anywhere. As we were saying, you have the branches, and often there are no banks in some villages, and often it's the postal bank and the postal banking services, which is the last line of defense where you can go and withdraw money or deposit money. And one more thing, you can no longer take out liquid money from the bank. You have to call the day before or 3 days earlier, and then you can withdraw cash at the counter, I say. In the post office today, in 10,000 offices and the 7,000 contact points when they have money, you can go to the post office and ask for cash, 80, 90, 100 euros, and you get that money at the counter without passing through the ATM. Once again, it's for inclusiveness, because there you're including those who don't have access to financial services or the underbanked and unbanked. Where is the money? That is the key question. It's a curious topic because it's about risk. If you want to open one of the a bank in a postal bank's banking service in Canada or in the U.S., they'll ask you, where is the money? You're opening a bank out of nothing. You will be having clients. Some will be poor, some will be rich, some will be very poor. It's risky. Where is the money? That's the question you will be asked in Canada and in the U.S. Up till 2000, it was strange in France because the 90 billion euros that were in the system they were in the public treasury. So the state was holding the bank accounts of people, and they were paying the post office 4-point-something% to 6-point-something% for holding those amounts. So there was no capital, and there was basically no rating back then. And if you had a problem, you would line up at the post office, and the state will pay in the case of a bank run. It's a bit, it's important because in 2008, when there was a bank run, there was a lot of people opened post office accounts because it was a refuge, because it's guaranteed by the state. It was explicitly guaranteed back then. Today, after the creation of the postal bank in 2005 in France, that's no longer the case. The state no longer backs these banks, because when Fitch or Moody's rates these banks, that is where the question arises. We're 100% owned by the state, and if there is a bank run, the state will support its property, its creation. Now, investments that were transferred from the state to the postal bank today, they are basically controlled by a decree, because you can't invest that money anywhere you want. It has to be invested in sovereign securities that you lend to the state. And in 2008, it went well with the crisis. And in 2008, when was the sovereign fund crisis in Europe, it wasn't so good because the banks had lent to Greece, to Spain, and to Portugal, and there was a decline there. But it was nothing compared, because the losses on loans to Greece were nothing compared to the losses on the U.S. continent.
Now, basically speaking, how does the system work? So it's subsidiary. We have agreements. And this, I'm referring to what I had on my first page. What we must understand is that the Postal Bank gives to the Postal Office every year a bill, let's call it a bill, to pay for the salesman, the wicket clerks, computer services, and so on. So the annual bill for subcontracting, if you want to call it that, is 3,200 million euros, about 4 billion Canadian. Now, on the economic model, the network is very important. So we spoke of 10,000 post offices in which you can do 430 different operations. These 10,000 offices, there are 3,700 in which you have at least one financial advisor, someone that you can meet to ask for a loan, to invest money, to get life insurance. So there are 3,400 institutions where you can have a financial counselor who will answer your questions. just like in a normal bank. On the rates, today, the postal bank is among the cheapest of the market, but you have to understand that the rates were 3 or 4 or 5 times lower than the rates you have in the commercial banks. That's important because it means that you can have a bank without making huge profits and having a reasonable profit, not huge profits. The definition of reasonable profit is enough to keep the bank going, to pay employees and so on. We're not forced to pay huge dividends or to pay the CEO. You want to become a CEO, so you won't get your $24 million per year, unfortunately. We have to warn him. So what's the difference between the postal bank and a normal bank? Well, we spoke of public property. We saw what happened in 2008, 2009. So the bank, postal bank, is controlled by Parliament. We have Parliament, a lower house and Senate, and they have services to follow what's happening in the postal bank. If a postal bank closes in a rural community, they get the complaints. Now, there's an irrational aspect in everything linked to postal affairs in France. If the population sees that we are losing a post office or that they don't see the letter carrier, there's a feeling of anxiety that's created among the population, and they raise up to protect the post office. It's something that comes from the guts. It's something that's really interesting, and I think you should use that to protect yourselves. Now, when they want to transform the financial services post in being postal bank, there was an objection saying you shouldn't become the bank of the poor. But we reacted and said, no, everybody should be able to use a postal bank. Now, when we look at what happened in other banks, there are many people who can't get a bank account there, and they come to us. Now, finally, what is a challenge? The only way to create such a postal bank is if you have the support of the public. You need a popular movement. Do it as soon as you can. If it was an issue in the upcoming elections in 2015, I think it could be a very important, interesting issue. And if it's not too much of a risk for you, this is a modest proposal from my part. But if you think it's important, you should use the opportunity of the elections in 2015 to broadcast this issue.
Thank you, Nicolas. So we'll open the floor, and as well as our participants on the internet for questions of the two presenters. Have any questions from the floor? Denis? A micro?
Non, c'est plus un...
Well, this is more of a comment than a question, especially for the bank in Great Britain. I'd like to know the history of your postal bank in England. We get the impression that the creation of this bank was easy, that it's been there all along, as is the case in France. Is that true? Now, what is the reaction of your commercial banks, both in France and in Great Britain, to this postal bank? You have very strong banks in these two countries, so what is the reaction of these banks? Did they accept it because you've basically had it all along, and the commercial banks don't dare to attack the postal bank, either in France or in England? I'd like to understand this because here in Canada, there's great objection from our major banks against the possibility of a postal bank. So what's the reaction in France and in England? Andy?
Yes, thank you, Dennis. The history of the banking financial services in the UK, we always had from the 60s, 70s, a Jara Bank was set up by Tony Benn, late Tony Benn, who recently passed away when he was Postmaster General. That bank was then sold when Maggie Thatcher was Prime Minister to Alliance and Leicester. So there's always been banking services at the UK Post Office. They've just developed greater in recent years because of the commercial link-up, the joint venture with the Bank of Ireland. The Bank of Ireland tendered for that joint venture, and it was a process where other banks also applied, UK banks as well. So at the end of the day, the Post Office procurement arrangements gave it to the Bank of Ireland, and that had to be supported by the government because the Post Office was wholly owned by the government. In terms of what the reaction is from the commercial banks, well, all of the leading commercial banks have got contracts with the Post Office where the people with current accounts with those banks can use their debit cards at the Post Office. So there's a lot of arrangements with the commercial banks. But I think the reality is it's very similar to the last point about France. The commercial banks primarily see the Post Office banks as the poor person's bank, where the people they don't want to give bank accounts to come to the Post Office. So it's the unbanked, the people who may not have bank accounts at all. There's the ability for people who are collecting their state pension or their family allowances to do so through what's called a Post Office card account. So government monies that are due to be paid for social services can be drawn at the Post Office. So the Post Office has always been a place to get money. The UK Post Office, we have our own arm of internally, we've got 2,000 workers who process and deliver cash to the 11,800 post offices every week. So ostensibly across the UK, that's the place to get your money, other than ATMs. So are the banks happy about it? I don't suppose they are, but at this point in time, our share of the market is not that much threatening. There's lots of competition from lots of different banks and insurance providers. I think if we was to, I mean, it's a fascinating question because the UK Post Office has relied upon government subsidy for many, many years, and only last November, the coalition government announced another subsidy for 3 years of £640 million. Now that has to get European Union state aid approval. So there's going to come a point, I believe, when the commercial banks will start to complain about it not being a level playing field because of the government subsidy to keep the post offices open. So I think there is a conflict on the way, I suspect. It'd be interesting to watch this. But certainly the post office is seen as a place for the people's bank, the people's post office, and we're trying to appeal to all groups of people, but certainly younger people as well, because there's a tradition for people drawing their pensions at post office, so the customer base is older people, but we want to attract younger people, and that's where bureau de change is so important. Hopefully that answers your question, Dennis.
Nicolas, would you like to add? No?
No. On the question of the history and the possibility of widening our services, this was done. In 2005, the Canadian banks wrote a white paper where they criticized us with everything. Oh, yes, these people are civil servants. They're paid by the state. They will take advantage of us. And certain studies came out saying that the financial services of the post office could get up to 10% of the market, and which was not the case. I didn't say this before, but compromises were offered to the bank. For example, Passbook A, the savings passbook, could be opened only in the Crédit Mutuel and the Postal Bank. When the Postal Bank was created, the European Commission attacked, and this allowed all the banks to have a passbook. Now, when the banks were allowed to open up the A passbook, it happened during the crisis, and they were allowed to keep the money. So they recovered 110 billion euros on the A passbook. So that calmed down the commercial bank lobby. Now, concerning competition, we see that we don't have 10% of the market. Clients who come to the postal bank saying, I'd like to have a loan, they work with our financial counselors. Our financial counselors make an offer. They go to their bank and they say, well, the postal bank gave me this offer, and their commercial bank gives them a better loan. So banks are ready to lose money so as not to lose clients to the postal bank. Be aware of this, because this is a very normal behavior for the commercial banks. The idea right now is to hold on to a customer and get their children, get the money from the estate, and keep them forever as a client. At a term, there was a term used in financial services where they used the term harpoon a client. They're hooked, and then you don't let them go. Now, concerning the postal bank, the commercial banks have calmed down, but at the beginning they harassed us and they tried to get rid of us.
Actually, this question follows on Nicolas' response there. Mark Armstrong was in Paris this past October, and there was what seemed to be a marketing or advertising push by the French Postal Bank. There were balloons, advertising, etc. And do you know why this was needed? Are people not familiar with the Postal Bank? And to what extent does the Postal Bank advertise its services?
C'est des campagnes commerciales.
Well, these are advertising campaigns like all banks have. I don't know what kind of campaign you had in this case with balloons, but what will happen soon, and we'll see with the colleague from Banca Postal tomorrow, in post offices. You know, I went to the end of the street here to your post office, and there's lots of room in that post office in front of Parliament. You've got lots of room to offer different services. So in the Banque Postale, they have loans, parcels, and a mobile post. They have partnerships, and they sell telephone services. Now, there's another service that can be added, which will allow you to pay with your cell phone. So you have in the same place a bank and a place where you can buy a cell phone. I don't know exactly what they were promoting in the case of the question, but
I guess in the face, and this perhaps will be an opinion we're asking of you, and in the face of decreasing revenues from mail services among the post offices and increasing revenues from financial services, at what point does a post office become is a post office delivering financial services, or does it become a bank that's delivering mail services? Go ahead.
I think it's a very fascinating question, actually. The post office in the UK has always done a very, very wide range of transactions and different products and services. Something like 160 different services that the counter clerks provide. And that's why we believe that the counter staff have got the ability and the capability to take on the knowledge of new services, new financial services. Training is important, but they've got the intellect and the knowledge of how to deal with the customer. As it stands today in the UK, 40% of the income of the post office is via Royal Mail letters and packets and parcels and special delivery. So that's its single biggest income pillar. Financial services is at 28% or thereabouts. Will they flop over? Possibly. I think it depends on packets and parcel, which we all know is a growth area. But you know, I think the post office has got to be first and foremost a place to do mail services, but also to get good value financial services. I think it's getting a balance and a blend. The problem we've got in the UK is our rural. We've got 7,000 rural sub-post offices, and they all lose money. They have to be kept open by subsidy, and the government has to pay for that subsidy. And to be fair, all governments of all political persuasions have supported those rural sub-post offices. It's all part of the social fabric of society that you've got the sub-post offices there. It's, you know, in many villages, it's actually the last shop in the village. And it's so important to keep that there. So, I mean, the British UK Post Office, as it's the single biggest retail outfit in the whole UK, it's so important to society. That's why the government needs to support it. So it can't just survive purely on Royal Mail products and income. It needs to expand and develop beyond that, and needs to be able to compete with the modern market. So I think there's a balance to be had there. But if we was to put all our eggs in one basket, the problem is it could all fall over. So it's about protecting the service going forward, and it needs to be a balanced portfolio of mails and financial services and government services as well, because government services are vitally important as well. Post office needs to be the shop window of government, where the people can identify and touch with government in their localities.
Wow.
Well, this morning, this was mentioned by Simon. There's less mail and more points of call. And I'm saying that for you. The door-to-door delivery is basic. It's fundamental. It's at the heart of the mail service. Going door to door, saying hello, having somebody who goes house by house every day is priceless. Now, to become a post office that offers financial services or a financial service that offers postal services, that's the choice of society. But I believe that door-to-door service is fundamental. Should that be subsidized? Of course it can, through offering banking services, but don't forget that you have parcels. In France, we're wondering, there are letter carriers who distribute parcels, and there will be more and more parcels. That is one part of the industry that's developing. So we want to use all these possibilities, keep all these doors open. Now, obviously, will require subsidies. One service will subsidize the other, and depending on the trend and the needs. But we can always ask the question of parliamentarians. We need the post office in our society. What will you do to see to it that we keep it? That's the main question. And after that, there are all sorts of possibilities. Maybe we'll discuss it tomorrow. What else can be done by the post office? There are financial services, but there are many other services that could be offered by the post office.
Sylvain Lapointe?
Well, there seems to be two different models. The French model seems to be a model where the post office also offers banking services. It's one group that offers bank services and the post office, while in the United Kingdom, it's distinct. Now, one of these two groups was privatized to a great degree, but in Great Britain, you have banking services offered in the post offices, and that creates profits. Are these profits shared with Post Office and with the private shareholders? In other words, has the private shareholder managed to get profit from the Post Office in the United Kingdom?
Okay, the Post Office Royal Mail model, they're two separate companies. Royal Mail is now highly profitable on the back of significant tariff increases in recent years. When Moya Green turned up, they barely had enough money to pay the wages of the postmen and women, and they had no cash, had cash flow problems. There was declining income and revenue, and that's been turned around, not least of all because of significant job cuts and transformation. And comrades here from Canada Post will identify with transformation and job cuts. Royal Mail, as it stands today, is an extremely profitable company, and the shareholders will be getting dividends. It's only in its infancy. It was only privatised last October. The Post Office is something different again. The Post Office actually was a millstone around Royal Mail's neck, in that the Post Office hasn't made money for years and years and years. It's seen as a social service. It's seen as a part of the fabric of society for communities. The UK Post Office has relied upon government subsidies of billions of pounds for the last 10, 15, 20 years. Every 3 or 4 years they get another subsidy which gives them 3 or 4 years of the ability to be sustainable and viable going forward. So the current government subsidy runs to 2018. So this current government has actually committed the next government to 2 years of subsidy in the life of its 5-year term. And all of the government subsidies have to go through to get European state aid approval, and that takes about a year. So the post offices don't make profit. If it wasn't for the financial services, the loss would be greater. So the idea is actually to build up financial services. Financial services have got a greater margin, a greater income, and then become less reliant upon government subsidy going forward. So the aim of the post office management is ultimately to become self-sufficient on income through financial services, payment for postal services, and payment from government for government services. But it's going to be a long, long journey to get there because the model is not profitable at all as it currently stands. So, I mean, they are very, very distinct, and you're correct. They are in the post bank scenario in the French post office. La Poste post office bank is entirely different from the post office in the UK. There is different models. The CUPW of the UK would prefer the UK post office to have its own post bank and be owned by the state, the post office, and that all profits go into the post office. As it currently stands, with the joint ventures and the link-ups that we've got, effectively it's white cover, it's white paper. The products are sold on the brand of the post office, although they're not post office products. They're Bank of Ireland products, and the Bank of Ireland shares in essentially the margins and the profit that's shared equally. So essentially the makeup is that the Bank of Ireland products are sold across post office counters, the outlet is post office counters, the products are Bank of Ireland. And that, that arrangement is in place till 2023. I like the La Poste model where the La Poste post bank is owned by the state and the post office. And that's obviously, I think it's fascinating you've had the ability to see two different models. Having said that, we're very supportive of developing financial services, and we hope that the Bank of Ireland joint venture is successful because we need more income. That's why we need business banking accounts, children's accounts, and we need to roll the current account out across the whole of the UK. So we do see how vitally important financial services are, and we do see the need for our members to be upskilled and to pass qualifications to be able to sell and advise on financial services products. So you have to separate Royal Mail from the Post Office. Now, none of Royal Mail's profits help the Post Office, and indeed Royal Mail is looking for value for money for its services across the counter, across the post offices, and I dare say Moya Green is going to be trying to drive down the charges, the costs that she pays to the post office for doing Royal Mail services. So I can see a battle taking place between Royal Mail UK and the Post Office UK in due course, because obviously the post office want to get as much money from Moya Green and Royal Mail as possible. So it's a fascinating situation, but as I say, it's the first post office in the world that separated its mails and its parcels and packets from its retail customer-facing arm, and I hope it doesn't go anywhere else, to be perfectly honest.
Well, Canada Post did separate it as far as organizationally, internally, but that's a very interesting observation on what's happening in the UK. Nicolas, did you want to talk about the subsidization of Post?
Le modèle français, c'est un petit peu...
Well, the French model is basically the opposite. The state owes money to the post office. Every year there are subsidies that go either way. I'll give you an example, for example. On newspapers, the Canada Post distributes the newspapers. Every year, the cost and distribution of newspapers gives a deficit of 350 million euros to distribute the newspapers. So every year, basically, the state, the post office, has a deficit of 500 million euros linked to activities for the community, such as banking services or distributing newspapers. For example, we've accepted to give a bank account to everyone who asks for it, and that creates a deficit of 25 to 30 million euro per year. But the important question here is that it's possible to be profitable today, even by delivering mail, even though volumes are going down. Now, today, the French state is saying, I don't have enough money to pay for all these public service missions, and there's a reduction in mail volumes, so they're hiring less, and we're losing about 4,000 jobs per year. We're about 230,000. We've lost 80,000 jobs since 2002. 12 years, a loss of 80,000 jobs, and we're losing jobs every year. 2013, we lost 4,400 jobs.
So we have a question specifically for Andy, and that's from the internet from Mark Armstrong, who asks, can you please speak to the fact that Guernsey has its own post, and if you think Wales or other areas may follow?
Okay. Yes, the Isle of Man also has its own post, and as does Jersey and Guernsey. They're their own postal administrations. We actually organise and have membership in Guernsey and Jersey and the Isle of Man, but they are separate postal administrations. Wales and Scotland, England and Northern Ireland makes up the post office. There's going to be a referendum in Scotland later this year for independence. So, I mean, you've seen that in Canada with your separatists. We've got Scotland wanting, or the Scottish National Party that's in control in Scotland at Parliament wants to have independence. If the Scottish people were to vote for that, then that would have consequences on Royal Mail and the Post Office, because they're national companies that includes Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland and England. Personally, I don't think the Scottish people will vote for independence, but there's a big campaign for independence, and obviously that, if it does happen, it will have an impact. But as it stands, the UK Post Office and the UK Royal Mail operate in Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales and England, and so do we as the CUPW. But we also got members in Guernsey, Jersey and Isle of Man as well, which are separate postal administrations. Hopefully that answers Mark's question.
Thank you. Thank you. So Alan Blaines has sent in a question, perhaps not for our panelists, but maybe for the more politically astute in our room here today. The question really is would a campaign of postal banking supporters internationally spotlight the I guess the fraudulent nature of the Canadian government, the government of Canada, in hiding the CPC study on postal banking, and will shame them into actually releasing it to the public? Anyone want to comment on the Harper government's ability to be shamed? Sorry, Alan, we're not able to to take that one on, but in my opinion, I think it's pretty obvious that Harper is shameless. So, are there any other questions from the floor? Jim, Brother Sauber.
I have a question for Alan. So this must be a daunting prospect for the CWU to have these companies separated. And you mentioned a minute ago that the CEO of Royal Mail will be putting pressure on the post office to lower their costs. And so you'll be representing workers on both sides of that transaction. And I'm wondering what you're doing to prepare for that kind of prospect, because that just doing collective bargaining, that cannot be a welcome development.
Yes, I mean, I represent all the post office workers, but I also, part of my portfolios, I represent the administration grades in Royal Mail that look after finance, HR, payroll, etc. So I face up to both the senior management teams in the post office and Royal Mail. It's early days yet. The synergy between Royal Mail is such that, I mean, the UK government got it wrong. Should never have split them up. The problem we've got is that we didn't want the post office to be privatised. So the CWU's position was that we didn't want to see a privatised Royal Mail and post office. So we're pleased that the post office has been retained by the state and that it's government owned, people owned. Are we going to be able to get Royal Mail back into public ownership, government ownership, public ownership? It's going to be a difficult struggle to do that because talk about railways and other organisations. The telecoms was privatised by Margaret Thatcher in '84. That was part of Royal Mail as it was at the time. And I think this is if you look at this across the whole of the world, the Mail's profit generated the money to be able to develop telephony. The general post office, as it was in the UK, GPO, was telecoms, mails, and the post office. And the telecoms become profitable very quickly, and then that's when the Conservative government decided to privatise the telecom side. Now we've seen Royal Mail privatised as well. We've got a foot in both camps. We're going to have to organise and make sure that we do the best for members in both areas. But I mean, I think that your body can't survive without blood, and the blood is the mails and the parcels and the packets. They are so inextricably linked that it's a false separation. It's a false divorce that the government shouldn't have done. So what we need to ensure is we've got a viable Royal Mail that keeps all of its work in the post office and doesn't take its work elsewhere. Our worries are that the big supermarkets, the Tesco's, the Sainsbury's, etc., start offering alternative post office services for mails, for people to collect their mails, for people to come and post their mails, and that could be the death knell of the post office. So we've got to ensure that the post office is viable and has a healthy relationship with Royal Mail going forward. That's vitally important. And the CWU, I think, unites those two organisations now, and we will be making sure that the Royal Mail and the Post Office can have a healthy relationship. We've got our annual conference starts tomorrow in Bournemouth, and Royal Mail management and Post Office management are invited, and we'll be hosting a reception for them, and we want them to do good work together. But it is difficult. We're already seeing, just give you an illustration, we're seeing the Post Office has awarded the contract for security and cleaning services to another firm, and the Royal Mail currently provides the cleaning services and the security services through its Romec arm. So the Post Office is trying to get better value for money, and therefore you've got a situation where what we call CUPW in Europe, where people's undertake the transfer of their undertaking and protection of employment. Obviously, Europeans will know about CUPW a lot, but we will see our members that are in Royal Mail providing cleaning services being CUPW'd over to the new successful company. And our fears are that Royal Mail will start to lose all its ancillary work with the Post Office, because the Post Office will look for better value for money or for it to be cheaper. And we've got to keep the services together. So it's going to be a challenge for us, and we've got to make sure that we can keep membership in both Royal Mail and the Post Office.
So we have a question from Mike in Kamloops for Nicolas. The post offices in Denmark and Sweden have merged. They are still publicly owned. Do you see a day when faced with competition, post offices in Europe will merge, say Belgium and France?
Well, they came together, but part of their capital is held by CVC Partners, which also holds a 30 or 35% of the Belgian post office, and which is going all over the place. And they're also involved in logistics. And I want to come back to what I was saying earlier. There's something that we have, the Universal Postal Union, which depends on the, which is part of the UN system, and it's a great history, a great story, because it's an ideal, and the idea is for this, these services to be universally available. But in terms of what we've seen among European post offices, in fact, comparison is difficult. In Holland, there's it's very concentrated. So there was privatization. Some competitors came in, but there's no minimum wage. So often there's students and mothers and retirees providing the service, and they're paid between 5 and 8 euros an hour. 5 euros is when they are insured. So this is an economic model that's come into place, and it's one of the so-called success stories of privatization. And then in terms of the alliances between Norway and Sweden and Denmark, Sweden, I mean, I have no real problem with their system logistically. We had, in fact, proposed to have a European stamp at one point. It wouldn't be that difficult. No face value, just a stamp that you would put on an envelope when you wanted to send mail to another European country. But people, liberals and lobbies were outraged, because this was a symbol of union that was terrible for them. So that stamp idea was rejected with ridiculous arguments. But because the stamp has a symbolic value. Brother?
The mutualisation of the Post Office Limited, obviously with the commentary that you've given us about the company being split up and how that's a probably clear and present danger for many of us in the room. There's certainly recent moves by the CEO in Australia that leads us to believe that they're looking to split it up a bit. the opposition we've been able to create over there politically is pretty solid, but if they start mucking around and splitting up the company and offering sort of different models, they might be able to split the opposition by offering sort of certain bait to various community groups. So I suppose we're interested in hearing more about how this mutualisation is going to work. I mean, are the people who run these sub-post office going to become all sort of like owners of one big co-op, or is that the way of the future, and how's that going to work? How's that going to play out in splitting up the revenue between different offices of different sizes and so forth?
Okay, thanks for the question about mutualisation. The mutualisation idea came from the Liberal Democrats. It was in their manifesto, and they've been the ones got a coalition government in the UK where the Conservative Party is the biggest party, but they're in power with the support of the Liberal Democrats, who are the third biggest party, and the Liberal Democrats have been the one that have been pushing the agenda for the separation of the post office from Royal Mail, and indeed the ministry, which is called Business Innovation Skills, used to be called the Department of Trade and Industry. They're fronted up by the Lib Dem ministers throughout the whole of that ministry is Lib Dems, and it's their idea. It feels like a cuddly, nice policy, because who could really argue with a mutualisation? Because it just sounds right, doesn't it? Mutual. It's got to be mutual for all of us. So they've been pushing this mutualisation. We spent the whole of last year engaging in a big group of interested parties, or so-called stakeholders, where we talked about how and what a mutualisation would look like. So on that stakeholder group, I was there on behalf of the CWU. Our sister union, Unite, who represent the managers, were there, and another sister union, the Federation of Sub-Postmasters. There's a correlation here with in Canada, in that we've got another organisation that represents the Sub-Postmasters. They were part of that. It hasn't really got off the ground yet, and the stipulation as to what before mutualisation could actually come about was that the post office had to be financially viable and self-sufficient. So you've already heard that the government's agreed a subsidy to 2018. So there's no prospect of getting the post office in profit by 2018. It's going to take a few more years later than that. So they're saying that the first prerequisite before mutualisation could happen is that it becomes self-sufficient and not reliant upon state subsidy. So it could be seen as a bit of a pipe dream. The other thing is that our general election is May 15, so if there is a change of party, and let's hope that Labour gets re-elected, then I'm not so sure that mutualisation won't die a death. The Labour Party hasn't opposed mutualisation, but it hasn't been championed at the bit, saying it's wonderful. We don't know how mutualisation would work, because the sub-post offices, to all intents and purposes, own their own stake in the post office, because they bring the sub-post office to the people, and they act on behalf of the post office. In terms of a workers' cooperative, we want to have a greater say in the running of the company. We want to be able to, the strategic direction of the company, but I think that mutualisation could be dangerous for organised labour, because organised labour could be in conflict with mutual, because I think the idea of mutual will be for the workers to accept things because of the mutualisation and the well-being of the company, and therefore they'd be less active in trade disputes over pay, terms and conditions. So at the moment I think the jury's out. But at the earliest opportunity, mutualisation won't take place till 2020, and it would need an Act of Parliament where parliamentarians vote upon it. So it's a very embryonic stage at the moment, and hopefully it will die a death.
Thank you. So I had promised Sister Cass that I would intersperse the presentation here with some bankers' jokes, and when I was polishing them off, thinking a banker's joke would be about the foibles of bankers, and their activities. And when I was looking at them, I thought, well, bankers don't think they're funny, and the general public don't think they're jokes. So are there any other questions from the room? Well, seeing none, I'd like to thank our presenters for the very informative talks that they've given today. So, on behalf of Nicolas and
Thank you very much.
It's a knife.
So we're calling up two more presenters now. So while Jim gets his ears, I will introduce him. Actually, Jim Sauber has been a friend of Canadian Union of Postal Workers for actually longer than I've been National Secretary Treasurer, which as of May the 2nd will be 18 years. So his relationship with us goes back a long ways. He is currently Chief of Staff for the National Association of Letter Carriers in the United States, being the right-hand person for the President. Jim joined the NALC as an economist in 1985, following his completion of a BA in economics from the University of Michigan in 1982. And he was director of research for 16 years with the NALC, during which he saw them through 7 rounds of collective bargaining, as well as achieving his master's from Johns Hopkins University, and has, in respect of financial aspects, has served as chair and is currently the vice chair of the Employees Thrift Advisory Council, which is to the federal board that manages the Thrift Savings Plan. So with that, I'll turn the podium over to Jim Sauber.
This is the clicker here. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. We're getting into the difficult hours where the day is starting to get long, and I think our hosts have made the catastrophic mistake to invite an economist to speak at this hour. I want to thank the brothers and sisters in Canada and Quebec for inviting me here. The CUPW is one of the great unions in the world, and it's always a pleasure to be here. There's a chance to sort of learn new things and get new ideas, and I was sort of fascinated this morning when Linda McQuaig spoke, made the point that the case for postal banking was actually much stronger than the case for public liquor stores. And I thought to myself, I had a brilliant thought. I thought, why not? We really need the money in the U.S. Let's do both. And then I thought again and thought, well, knowing how much our members drink at union conventions, that maybe the mail wouldn't get delivered anymore. So we'll just stick with postal banking. So anyway, what's clear just from the colleagues that preceded us, we've in North America, we've always been very proud of the fact that we've resisted this worldwide neoliberal wave in the postal sector. We've tried to hold on to this ideal of a universal, publicly owned, government-owned universal service financed with a postal monopoly. And we've really been proud of that. But what's clear is that we're just miles and miles behind other countries in this area of postal banking. And so it's so important for us to get up to speed, because it's such an important opportunity, a way to preserve our universal service in the mail services area. Okay. I thought I'd give you a little background of what's happening in the U.S. So that put it in context of why we're interested in postal banking. And here I want to emphasize that all 4 unions in the U.S., our unions are structured in occupational ways. But I'm here with colleagues from the Mail Handlers Union and the American Postal Workers Union. And we're working very closely together, and there's a commitment from all our unions to pursue postal banking. But right now we're in the midst of a major crisis. Meaning I think in the popular mind, most people think that the Postal Service is a failing institution because of the internet. If not the Great Recession, the internet is killing the Postal Service. And in fact, we've been through a really incredibly rough patch the last several years. We've lost about 25% of our letter mail volume. We've lost about 25% of our workforces. It's been a very brutal adjustment period. But by and large, the financial crisis of the Postal Service is a separate issue. The Postal Service is actually earning profits now. It has recovered from operational profits. It's recovered from the Great Recession. But we're reporting massive losses because of a mandate imposed during the Bush years on the Postal Service that requires us to pay tens of billions of dollars to pre-fund decades worth of future retiree health benefits. So over the last 7 years, we've reported $49 billion in losses, and about 80% of that is just from that mandate. So, and I just sort of emphasize that the Postal Service, as we face a unique constraints, we may be the largest postal service in the world. We generate $65 billion in revenues annually, but we're probably one of the most least diversified. So we're really totally dependent, or almost entirely dependent on letter mail volume and packages. And we also have an additional constraint that doesn't pertain, certainly in Europe, and doesn't pertain here in Canada, which is we have a legal constraint in the law that bans us from doing non-postal services. So we're sort of by law required to stick to our knitting, which is the delivery of mail and packages. And that obviously poses an additional hurdle when we want to get into financial services. So I thought that I should emphasize that we face, particularly those extra burdens to win this battle for postal banking. Fortunately, we're united, and our overall approach is, we're not putting all our eggs in the postal banking basket. We're also trying to reinvigorate use the postal services networks to become a leader in the e-commerce sector, which is booming. Postal Service's revenues are really going through the roof. We're doing about 40% of FedEx's deliveries now in the United States. We're gaining market share in package delivery, but we want to expand it beyond rather than close down our networks. We want to use them to become a powerhouse in e-commerce. Use these mail processing plants as warehouse hubs, recycling centers, and to sort of build on the sort of last mile delivery focus. We want to repurpose the post offices to provide state and local government services. I like that idea. Our brother from Great Britain talked about being the front office for the public sector at the very local level. We're pushing using vote by mail, making every election a vote by mail election. It's a movement that's growing across the United States. On the West Coast, in Oregon, in Washington State, and California, most people vote by mail, and it's been tremendous for democracy and tremendous for working people. Voter turnout in Oregon, where all elections are conducted by mail, is 87%, which compares to an average of about 53% elsewhere. And the people makes it possible to vote are working class people. So this is not only important for us in jobs, but it's important for our democracy. So we're pursuing this postal banking idea in the context of that overall approach to sort of kind of rebuilding the Postal Service for the 21st century. As it was mentioned this morning, the Postal Service has a long history in postal savings. We had a postal savings bank in the U.S. from 1911 to 1967. Originally, it was created with the support of the American banking industry. It was sort of targeted for huge waves of immigrants from Europe who were used to saving through the Postal Savings Bank in their home countries, and also for low-income customers that the banks weren't really interested in serving. And so this was a way of funneling small-time savings back into the private banking system, because the Postal Service would redeposit their savings accounts with local regional banks. At one point, there was over $3.5 billion in deposits and 4 million customers back in 1947. But gradually, after all the New Deal financial reforms and the implementation of deposit insurance, took the fear out of putting your money in the bank, the sort of demand for the kinds of services the Postal Service was providing fell. And so by 1964, the deposits were down to just a couple $100 million, and eventually, under pressure from the banking industry, we just wanted to get rid of it. The Postal Service, closed the bank in 1967. So, which I think is an important thing to keep in mind for us as a political challenge, because whatever happens in this industry, you have to contend with Wall Street and the power of American banks. And I wanted to point out a difference, that there's a major difference between the U.S. and Canada in this respect. In Canada, if you have 5 or 6 banks that dominate the entire country, in the U.S. we have a very fragmented financial services sector. There's something on the order of 12,000 banks, commercial banks, and different kinds of credit unions. And there's a huge concentration of where the assets are in the major Wall Street banks. But in terms of just the sheer numbers and what that does to the politics of financial services is really important to keep in mind. Every member of Congress has a relationship with multiple small-town banks that have a lot of influence, and they have a lot to say about the nature of their sector and whether or not the Postal Service is going to be allowed into it. And we, as we've learned in recent years, we fought some major battles to try to reform the casino capitalism of Wall Street, and the banks came out of the Great Recession bigger and more concentrated than they were before. And that's largely because there were three banking lobbyists for every member of Congress, and everywhere you go. And both parties in the U.S. are totally in the pocket of these financial sector contributors. They dominate. For both parties, it's the biggest source of campaign money. And recently, the Supreme Court's been just deregulating political campaign contributions. They've concluded that money is speech. Which is absurd. Money is property. But nonetheless, we know, like Bob Dylan knows, that money just doesn't talk, it screams. And so it has a big say on what happens in the U.S. So that's sort of shaping, that kind of background is shaping our union's approach to pursuing postal banking. And our goal eventually is to get to the kind of services that our brothers just talked about in France and Germany, in France and UK, but we're going to have to get there through a different route. So our near-term strategy is to try to focus on building, providing the financial services that the Postal Service already has the authority to provide, and it does have some significant authority that it just isn't using. And then secondly, finding an issue where we can build popular support across all ideological parties in the U.S. for finding a role for the Postal Service to serve as a national infrastructure bank. So that's sort of the general approach, is that we're going to try to start small. There's no point in trying to, we support a major postal reform bill to sort of deal with these retiree health obligations, but we've made a decision not to try to put a provision authorizing postal banking into that legislation. We think it would just draw those 1,500 lobbyists from Wall Street and kill the bill dead. So the idea for us, given the unique nature of America's sort of dysfunctional political system, we're going to try to focus on where a postal savings bank could, solve some problems in a way that will draw broad support. And so the two kind of key problems that we think the Postal Service is perfectly sort of situated to address is, first, is this issue of financial exclusion, the fact that there are so many millions of Americans that don't have access to banking services, financial services, low-cost money transfer, remittance services. That's sort of widely accepted, and that's an area where I think there can be broad support for the Postal Service playing a role. And the second is this also an issue of the sort of crisis of American infrastructure. There's sort of general agreement that we need to, as a country, to be investing in our infrastructure. The problem is that no one can agree on how to finance it, and we think this postal savings bank can be the way to do it. Just to sort of go over what was talked about this morning, 68 million citizens are unbanked or underbanked, and this is not just an issue of sort of geography, of not being around where banks are. It's also an issue of affordability. There's plenty of people who live in neighborhoods where there's lots of banks, but they're not interested in serving low-income Americans. And so so when we talk about sort of financial exclusion, it's not just a geographical concept, it's a financial concept. It's an issue of affordability. So there's a lot of people that live right next door to banks that can't use them because they're just unaffordable. The fees are too high. That's 25% of the adult population, and the financial deregulation of the 1980s really sort of removed all obligations to serve local communities, and there's not a lot of profits to be made for most working class Americans. So on the average, last year 1,500 bank branches closed in the U.S. I think we're down 30% of the total number of branches, so there is certainly a geographical component. And basically the Postal Service is well positioned to be the ones to serve. We have a retail network of 32,000 post offices. Those are all the ones that the Postal Service runs itself. In addition to that, there's another 8,000 contract stations. Though that network is bigger than the networks of McDonald's and Starbucks and just about anything else you can think of combined. We have just a unique reach, and so we're particularly positioned to serve rural areas, and not just rural areas, but inner city, low-income areas where banks have largely disappeared. So what are folks doing that don't have access to financial services? They're going to this whole shadow non-bank financial service sector. They're going to check cashing, storefronts. They're going to pawn shops. They're going to rent to own arrangements on furniture and major purchases, car title loans. This is a whole huge industry out there, which by the way is also very politically tied in with campaign contributions, that's sort of preying on working class people who can't afford banking services but who desperately need them. I think our speaker this morning, John Anderson, mentioned the Office of Inspector General report about this issue. And I wanted to just emphasize something. And this is no fault of John's, but it's important to know the Inspector General in the U.S. does not speak for the Postal Service. We face the same problem in the U.S. as you do in Canada. We have an executive leadership that's really not interested in postal banking. The Inspector General is has an independent research budget, and has put out this white paper as a suggestion for the way to save, to maintain the universal network. But the reply from the Postal Service was very depressing and predictable, and it sounds almost exactly what you've heard from Canada Post. That's not something we could do. That the existing system works fine, and they don't see any role for the Postal Service. So this is literally something that the unions and the coalitions of progressive citizens in the United States is going to have to force on the Postal Service, because left to their own devices, they would not do it. I just kind of reemphasize the point I made a minute ago about the retail reach of our network. 59% of the post offices in the U.S. are in zip codes with there are either no banks or just one bank. And so we're absolutely perfectly positioned to serve needs that are going unmet right now. And we're working, and this is in part working with Jeff and Kathy in the CUPW on a mapping project. We're going to try to map all 50 states and hopefully map every congressional district, showing where post offices are relative to where commercial banks are, just to sort of demonstrate to political leaders that this is an idea that has a lot of merit. And so we've started to do that. I'll give you an example in my home state. This first slide kind of gives you where the bank branches are in the state of Michigan. And you can see down around Detroit and the big cities in the southern part of the state, there's a lot of coverage. But the further north you go in the rural areas, banks become few and far between. And so we sort of mapped out where these, what you could call banking deserts, and this is just for one state. And what we'll see as we go across, we're doing this for all 50 states, particularly in the western and southern parts of the country, these heavily rural areas, there's no banks anywhere. And the post office could serve all these areas. And for us, it has a particularly important lesson for us is that we think it'll draw a lot of Republican interest because those tend to be rural and southern areas are the Republican parts of the country. And we're ultimately going to have to sell our ideological opponents on this idea. So we're in the midst of doing this. We hope, like I said, we're going to try to we're working with the Public Banking Institute, which I'll talk about a little bit later, to try to map in these things down by congressional districts so that we can go in and convince the leaders in Congress that this is a good idea. If you just want to, so how do we get started? So we're not going to wait for Congress to act. So the Postal Service already provides some basic financial services. It's the single biggest provider of money orders and electronic money orders in the country. It's not a very user-friendly system. It doesn't have an online component like it should. But this is areas where we could move and really kind of go into those areas where you see the pawn shops and the payday loan lenders and sort of the sort of vultures of the financial services. When we could take that business away, and it's a big business. The OIG report concluded that households that are among the 68 million who are unbanked or underbanked nonetheless spend $89 billion a year on financial services. That's what they pay in interest and penalties and fines from this sort of predatory portion of the financial services sector. And it concluded if the Postal Service just got 10% of that, it could generate $9 billion in revenue. And they could do it at much more affordable rates, obviously. And so what we want to do is try to expand using the existing authority to move into payment services, electronic money orders, e-commerce sort of purchasing arrangements, check cashing, and reloadable debit cards, which the Postal Service already has the authority to do these gift cards, and they're reloadable. The idea would be to add savings account features to them, making it possible, for example, for workers, low-wage workers, to have their paychecks deposited on their postal cards. Maybe adding interest-bearing features to these postal cards and offering small-scale microcredit types of loans. A lot of Americans, low-income Americans who go bankrupt, they come remarkably close to being able to cover their costs. And there was one study the FDIC did that showed that the average shortfall for a person who filed for bankruptcy was $26 a month. So with just very modest levels of microcredit at reasonable interest rates, not the 800% interest rates, but just a modest, even to cover the higher risk. The Postal Service has tons of cash flow. They can bear the risk with the $65 billion cash flow. They can have much more reasonable interest rates. And they have a system in place with the federal government to recover any loans that people don't repay through the tax system, through payment systems for unemployment insurance, through the payment systems for Social Security and disability. All these systems could be fed through this postal bank card. And so that's an area we think the Postal Service doesn't have to wait for Congress to do. It has the authority to do this now. And so that's a big part of our campaign with the unions, is to put pressure on the Postal Board of Governors to start using this authority and providing these services. And we think if they do it, it would build support for a more broad-based postal savings bank. The other area that we think the Postal Service could really solve a national problem and is well positioned to do is to provide the retail network for a national infrastructure bank. This is a wide, broad understanding in the U.S. that we're fundamentally sort of running down the quality of our infrastructure. I read before I came yesterday in the Washington Post there are 66,000 bridges in the United States that need repair. They need to be rebuilt or repaired. There's just the numbers are astounding. Every year the American Society of Civil Engineers does a survey about what needs to be done over the next decade, and they conclude there's $3.6 trillion in work that needs to be done to maintain our infrastructure. Things like the Highway Trust Fund are running out of money, and everybody agrees we have to spend the money. And everybody agrees there's broad support to create a national infrastructure bank. The problem is that there's no agreement on how to finance it. The Democrats want to use tax money to seed it, which would make entirely good sense. The Republicans reject that. The Republicans want to just give a huge tax giveaway to corporations to repatriate their profits from overseas and just give them a tax holiday to finance this bank. And of course, that's totally unacceptable. So our feeling is a postal savings bank, if you could have 10 million accounts with very modest amounts of money, you would have the seed money for a national infrastructure bank that could be used to leverage, to sort of co-write corporate bonds and state bonds and infrastructure spending across the country. We think this is an area that will have a lot of promise, and we think it's our intention to make this an issue in the next presidential campaign to sort of build public support for it. So the infrastructure spending, our idea would be this would sort of alleviate the fears of the banks that we would go into competition with the private banks. All the funds in postal savings accounts would be turned over to a national infrastructure board. The Postal Service wouldn't be making any investment decisions. The decisions would be made in a sort of decentralized way, hopefully through democratic rules to make sure that the spending was done in the most socially responsible way. But the idea would be that we'd be a conduit, and so we could provide safe, low-cost savings options for working-class Americans, and at the same time solve this national infrastructure crisis. And this would all, of course, help us support a universal post office network. So this truly is a win-win strategy. In the words of the Canada Post paper, which I just find astounding that they wouldn't share with the rest of the country. So our long-term strategy is we're working in a very tight alliance with our 3 other unions, and we have allies in the Public Banking Institute, which is a broad coalition of NGOs supporting a variety of public banking options, and it's really a great group. They have it covers the whole range of different ways to attack this problem. It's everything from credit unions to cooperative banks to state-owned banks. And one of the I know Brother Jim from Edmonton talked earlier today about the bank, the public bank in Alberta. There's a similar one that comes out of the same time period in the state of North Dakota. The Bank of North Dakota is a state-owned bank that handles all the financing for the state of North Dakota. So when they collect tax revenues from their citizens, it goes to the Bank of North Dakota. They pay all their bills there. They use this publicly owned bank, and they have about 10 different programs in which they funnel capital to help development in the state of North Dakota. For example, they provide very low-cost, affordable loans if you go to college in the state of North Dakota. If you want to start a business in the state of North Dakota, they have very favorable financing. This is all run by a state-owned bank in a very Republican state, and nobody opposes it. It's an absolute success story. So the Public Banking Institute is looking at all sorts of different ways to promote a public option in the financial sector. And it's really, I think, is an exciting time because the reputation of the American banks are at an all-time low following the catastrophe of 2008. And we think we can be part of it because the Postal Service is an institution in the United States that has tremendous public support. We routinely get 80% in public approval ratings, and we think we could be that trusted, federal option for public banking. So we're also, in addition to working in the grassroots and the NGOs, we're beginning to build a coalition politically in Washington. Another speaker mentioned Senator Elizabeth Warren, who's sort of a real hero of the financial crisis. She's taken up the cause of postal banking, and we're working together with her. All 4 union presidents met with her about 10 days ago, and we're working on a strategy to build support in both parties in Washington to make postal banking a long-term option for us. So with that, I'll stop, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
So thanks, Jim. So our next presenter is Rob Fiedler, who's a PhD candidate at the Department of Geography in York University. Rob specializes in the use of GIS, which is Geographic Information Systems for Urban Mapping and Spatial Analysis. His presentation is going to be talking about patterns and potential for post banking by mapping post offices and banks and payday lenders in 2 specific areas in Canada. So, Rob?
Okay, so first I'd like to thank the Canadian Union of Postal Workers for asking me to do the project and for inviting me to present the preliminary findings here. The 2 places that have been mapped are the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area and Newfoundland and Labrador. And just move on to an overview of what I'm going to talk about. So the project mapped the retail network of Canada Post locations, so that's both the corporate-owned ones as well as the franchisees. The big 6 banks, although in both places that's mostly the big 6, National Bank only has a few, or a relatively small network. And the major payday loan stores in the 2 locations. So when I say major, I mean the chain payday lenders. So there is a whole raft of potential sites that could be considered payday lenders or providing services like them. It would be very difficult to track them all down. So these are the big chains like Money Mart and the Cash Store, Cash and Go, and things like that. The purpose of the project was to reveal the spatial distribution of the Canada Post locations, the big 6 branches, and the payday loan stores. I would concur with the previous speaker that the geography is only part of the story, so I'd encourage you to think of that while I'm showing it. Is to look at the geographic context for postal banking. So if you're thinking about the pattern and the potential, what does the Canada Post network look like in a major urban region like Toronto and in a rural and remote province like Newfoundland? So the last piece, of course, is to identify what urban and rural differences look like. For the purpose of today, I've kept it very simple in terms of the questions that it's looking at. So how close are the Canada Post locations, big 6 branches, and payday loan stores to each other? And it's largely dealt with statistically. How many people live near Canada Post locations, big 6 branches, and payday loan stores? So when I counted how many people live near each of them, I was using Statistics Canada data from 2011. And specifically, I was using dissemination blocks or block counts. So this is the finest resolution data you can access. It only provides population counts, so the number of people, and how many occupied dwellings, nothing else. In order to connect the analysis to a wider understanding of the social geography, you have to move up a scale to dissemination areas or census tracts. And I've done some of that privately. I could talk about it in the question period, perhaps. So I realize that some of the people here wouldn't necessarily be familiar with the geography of the GTA Hamilton. So this is a very basic map just showing the municipalities that make up the area that was mapped. The city of Toronto at the center is the product of amalgamation about 15 years ago. So it is the old city of Toronto, which would be pretty much the city before 1950, as well as all of the post-war suburbs that sort of surround it. They are now sort of dissolved into it. The areas that are immediately adjacent to it, like Vaughan, Richmond Hill, and Markham on the north, are sort of the faster growing new suburbs and are quite densely populated. Mississauga and Peel on the western side are also large and densely populated. And then generally speaking, your urban area is mostly contained around the lake and wraps around. So a lot of what you see visually on the map is outside of the urban GTA. And I'll get to that perhaps a little later. So in terms of population for the whole area, we're talking about 6.5 million residents, 2.6 million in the last census in the city of Toronto. So if you're thinking about that, the old city represents about 700,000 of that. So you get a kind of feel for the old city versus the post-war suburbs. The rest of the GTA is 3.4 million, and I've broken it down to give you an idea. So Peel, which is the western part where the airport is and a lot of the new industry and suburbs that have developed since the 1970s, you have about 1.3 million. And then York region, which is above the city, is about 1 million. I've included it as an extended region. So the GTA has long been talked about. The GTA Hamilton is something that started to show up in provincial planning and policy discussions. So whenever I go to meetings or conferences that are talking about urban connectivity, if there are Metrolinx people there, they increasingly talk about the GTA and Hamilton. It's a very uneven breakdown, of course, 6 million people in one and then 500,000 in the other. In another way, the GTA is often talked about as a global city. So that can mean a discussion of it in terms of being a major global financial center. So it is the head or the location for the headquarters of the big 5 banks, as well as a number of the insurance companies. It's also home to many multinational firms' Canadian head offices, as well as the head office of many multinational firms. It's fast growing, so it's not as fast growing in percentage terms as Calgary and Edmonton, but even in the last census period, the region still grew by about 10%. It's fueled largely by immigration. So Canada receives between 250 and 300,000 immigrants a year. Somewhere between 40 and 50% settle in the GTA area. And the number fluctuates. It's been higher in the past, it's been dipping lately. In the city of Toronto, it's important to sort of pay attention to neighborhood scale changes. So there is a lot of discussion now about income and social polarization. So the city is not evenly distributed. There are wealthy areas and there are poor areas. People who followed the discourse within the city would be familiar with David Holchansky's maps on the 3 cities within Toronto. In a sense, there's an area in the center of the city that has been getting wealthier. So an area that roughly starts at Bloor and goes from Bloor Street up the Yonge Street corridor on both sides up to about the 401. And then another sort of cluster that's in central Etobicoke, as well as to a certain extent along the lake through Scarborough. The periphery of the city, which is now being talked about as city number 3, has become poorer over time, so the incomes have been falling. So that has to be sort of bared in mind when I start talking about the distances between things, that you have to factor in, especially when you think about financial exclusion, that say 500 meters from a bank or 1,000 meters from a bank or 2,000 meters from a bank means different things to different people depending on where they live in the city region and how they move around. So if you live in an area where you're reliant on walking, 500 meters to 1,000 meters is maybe acceptable. When you live further out and you have a car, you may find 2,000 meters no problem at all. Right? And of course, the last part to say about the GTA is, that you could sort of see on the map, was that it has a very large urban shadow. Right? So the portion of it that is urban has a much larger section that is influenced by that urban region. So basic numbers, these numbers were determined by using the online locators by each of the institutions' maps. So for Canada Post, I was using their website and doing queries to determine where their actual locations are. And then for the banks, the same thing. For payday lenders, I had to do a bit of a mix. So some of them, if they're large enough, have online locators. A number of them were simply listed by the Canadian Payday Loan Association in their member list. So you could see, based on the raw numbers, so you have 424 Canada Post locations versus 1,270 bank branches. That the bank network in the GTA Hamilton is much more extensive. Now that doesn't necessarily translate when you're thinking about it spatially. So the banks are often clustered together, so it doesn't mean they're providing considerably more coverage. I'll get to that in a minute. And obviously the payday lenders are a smaller and more concentrated geography. Look at how it looks. So the Canada Post locations across the region. It's perhaps a little easier to see this when I'm looking at home and I can zoom in and out and see what it looks like in a detailed way, but very clearly down in the bottom where the urban part of Toronto is, you have a very dense distribution of branches or of outlets. The thinner parts are the rural parts around the edge. So you're really getting, at least when you're looking at it on the map, a kind of picture of the distribution of population. If you look at the bank network, you can see that the fact that there are almost 4 times as many branches means that it's denser. But the coverage, at least from the way that I look at it, is not that much better. And I'll get to that in a minute. The main difference is when you look at the payday lenders. Okay, so the payday lenders, for someone like myself who has looked at the city of Toronto and the GTA a lot in different ways, I'm very familiar. As soon as I looked at this, I could tell that the pattern is the U that is long talked about in urban geography circles as the poverty U. So it's a long-standing pattern in which the area that I previously talked about as city number 1, that's up the Yonge Street corridor between Bloor and the freeway, is basically absent for the large part of payday lenders. So there are a few, they'll be at Yonge and Eglinton, and places like that, but by and large, the bulk of them are going up the 2 wings of the city. When you move out into the regional municipalities, you often get corridors. So you'll have a major retail or business street, and you'll find payday lenders sort of at regular intervals along it. So like Highway 7 through Brampton or King Street through Oshawa, for instance. The more interesting perhaps, or making it a little bit clearer, is when you look at the statistical results. So when you start to use those locations in GIS software like ArcGIS to be able to say how far are things from each other, or in the specific question that I asked was how close are the Canada Post locations, Big Six banks, and payday loan stores to each other. And what you do for that is you have one layer be for instance, be the bank, and you search from that 500 meters to see how many of the Canada Post locations fall within that 500 meters. So that's roughly what the table is trying to show. So when it says Canada Post locations within a distance of a payday loan store, that's what it means. It's selecting all of the locations that are, say, within 500 meters of a payday loan store. And it gives you, when you look across all the tables, a kind of rough idea of how they're situated. So the highlights for this to me would be, if you're looking at them, the geography of, say, payday loan stores mirrors the banks. Okay, so when you're looking at it, say, in the bottom where it says payday loan stores within a distance of a Big Six bank branch, 76.4% came out 500 meters or less from a bank. So one of the things you can take from that is the payday lenders are not creating a new geography to service gaps. They're shadowing the banks, more or less. And that wasn't really a surprising finding. Literature that exists examining patterns in Winnipeg showed roughly the same result. So it confirms what I've already seen in the literature. The other thing that it suggests, at least when you're looking at Canada Post versus the big banks, is that Canada Post's distribution or their network, if you look at it in relation to the banks, provides pretty good coverage. So yes, there are more bank branches, but because they're more densely concentrated than the Canada Post locations, Canada Post's actual coverage is good. And that sort of shows up in the next slide a little more clearly. So when you look at how many people live near Canada Post locations, Big Six banks, and payday loan stores, then what you're doing is you're saying, here's a bank branch, or here's the network of bank branches. Search out from that and collect all of the dissemination blocks that are within 500 meters, or all of them that have their geographic center within 500 meters. And then you can start to look at the service coverage, at least in general. This is not telling you a lot about the types of people that are within those areas that have been captured, but it is telling you the bulk or broad numbers. So you can see across it, the big six banks, when you're talking about very close, like 500 meters, they have somewhat better coverage, but it starts to even out as you get into the middle ground, so between 1,000 and 2,000 meters. It will, when I get to the end and talk about my sort of conclusions, says something about questions about how important banking deserts are, right? And that perhaps that is not the best thing to emphasize off the top, at least in terms of exclusion, that something more complicated is happening than purely saying there's no branches in an area. But nevertheless, when you're looking at it, the important part I would say is to look at 1,000 meters or less. So whenever I look at studies that talk about, say, food deserts, they usually use 1,000 meters as the cutoff for walking distance. So that's particularly important across Toronto, say, if you're talking about the city number 3 that I made reference to. So if you're looking at an uneven, unevenness across the city region, you want to look for places where people have to walk, where they don't have access to a car, and see whether those people are being well served. But they're going to be a percentage, perhaps a sizable minority of the population, but a minority nevertheless. So you have to factor that into any strategy. If we move to Newfoundland, I'm probably not the right person to give a whole lot of context since I don't know a lot about Newfoundland, but I'll try, and I'm sure I'll be corrected. So I put the basic numbers. So when we were talking about Toronto and the region, we're talking about 6.5 million. You move to Newfoundland and Labrador, you're talking about 500,000 people spread across a much larger area, with the largest metropolitan region being St. John's at about 200,000, the city itself a little over 100,000. And you can see from the other population centers, which are listed in order of their size, that the size of the communities drops off pretty fast. So Newfoundland has a lot of small communities. I would characterize it, and I could stand to be corrected, but that a lot of these would be characterized as remote. And so at least when I mapped it, if you look at the post office distribution, you have a lot of communities along the rugged coastline, not so much in the middle of the island of Newfoundland, and Labrador is very sparsely populated. Many of the small communities currently have a Canada Post outlet or office. Many of them don't have a bank, which makes Newfoundland very interesting in relation to the Toronto study. When I say uneven population dynamics, I'm thinking partly of policies at the provincial level to depopulate some of the outports. So there are questions when you're mapping the communities that have post offices, what's happening? So is the community, what is the size? So when I say how many don't have a bank but have a post office, you need to know more about what's happening within the community itself. So if we look at the basic numbers, the map locations were 397 for the post office. You see a big shift here between the corporate locations and the franchise locations, at least based on naming convention. So it's a much higher percentage are corporate owned versus franchise. That may matter. The big six banks, in contrast to the GTA, which has almost a 3-to-1 ratio, here it's the other way around. So there are far more post offices than there are banks. And of course, payday loan stores are a much smaller player in Newfoundland. There are perhaps a few reasons for that. I should also mention that the cash store, I believe, has gone bankrupt in the last few days. So one of their large chains, it's probably sort of symbolic to say or emblematic to say that Money Mart, which is the largest chain, only has one store. right? If we look at how it maps, and which one have I got? I don't know how well that shows, but probably should have used red dots. Canada Post's, so the mapping is quite dramatic. If I'd have used red dots, it would really jump out more. But you'll see that there is extensive coverage across the entire island. And there is quite a few locations in Labrador. If you look at what happens when you go to the banks, again, you get to see that urban concentration. So you really see the urban-rural divide in terms of how much coverage Canada Post has versus the big 6 banks. And to a certain extent, that was also true in the rural parts of the GTA. And of course, if we go to payday lenders, there are very few, and they are only in the largest population centers. Now, let's see how this turns out. Okay, oh, there we go. Now again, when we look at the questions, so how close are Canada Post locations, big 6 banks, and payday loan stores to each other, you'll see, of course, the role of distance. So I've had to change the analysis somewhat given the geography. You wouldn't expect the locations to be quite as closely located, especially in the rural parts of the province, so the numbers are more extended. I think that where it says 1,000, it should be 2,000. That was a typo. But you can see when you're looking, for instance, at Canada Post locations within a distance of a big 6 bank, the number is very low because there's so many more Canada Post locations that are not in an area that has a bank. It's different, of course, when you look at the banks. So if you look at the banks, they're obviously a high percentage of them are near a Canada Post location. A high percentage of them would be near a payday loan store. And of course, if you look at the payday loan providers, because there are so few of them, they're almost all within a very short distance of a of a big 6 bank. If we return to question number 2 for Newfoundland and Labrador, so how many people live near a Canada Post location, big 6 bank, or payday loan store? You can start to see the influence of the rural and remote. So the numbers start to drop. You won't see across the province a high number of people within 500 meters. But once you get up into the 1,000 to 2,000, which is what you would expect, a community that's somewhat more dispersed, but not sort of wildly dispersed. So what it means basically is that post office branch is going to be located in a small community, and it's going to capture most of that municipality's population in that populated place. There's still, of course, a number of places that don't have service. It was quite a challenge to map Newfoundland simply because of how large it is and how many small communities I would have to test to see if they had something. Also, if you look at the numbers specifically drawn with St. John's out of the mix, so St. John's is urban, which tends to skew the numbers a bit. You could see with the distance bands that you have fairly good coverage at 5,000 meters, so 5 kilometers for Canada Post, significantly lower for the big 6 banks, right? So this is the urban-rural difference that you see in there. It's one of the potentials that a mapping project like this would show. So I have a few, a brief list of summary of findings. So I mapped the retail networks. From that, I would make a claim that banking deserts exist in the GTA Hamilton, and I'm aware of a few of them from personal experience, but they're not a widespread phenomenon. It's not a case like when I read American literature on food deserts, where it's possible for a person to say that the entire inner city is lacking a grocery store. The geography of areas that are underserved is much more nuanced, and that has to be drawn out in a sort of further analysis. is also the case that you have to consider in many neighborhoods, and I know this from living in inner city Toronto and Hamilton, that yes, you see old bank branches that are no longer in service, but they're often in a location where there's another bank that's nearby. So it's not simply a case where closure in an urban area like Toronto means no service. In the rural areas, it's pretty clear that that probably has a greater impact. I think for your purposes, the most important might be, that if you look at the geography of Canada Post locations, especially if you include the franchisees, well, actually you have to include the franchisees to make the statement, but that there is a sufficient geography. There is a sufficient retail network and scope or reach to be able to do postal banking, right? So as opposed to being able to say that it will fill a geographic hole that the banks are leaving behind, it's important to consider that it has enough reach to be able to provide the service, which is important. Now in Newfoundland, and you can see the line, census subdivisions are municipalities. I use the census terminology just simply because it's very difficult to summarize all of the different types of municipalities that exist. So these are towns and unorganized areas, mostly in Newfoundland. But there are 235 of them that have a post office, but no bank. And I think if you were to extend that elsewhere, you'd find similar things in rural Canada elsewhere. And then, of course, I've already mentioned this, but I'll reiterate. It's the link between the payday lenders and the banks. So the idea that the payday lenders are somehow filling a geographic void is not true. Okay, they're shadowing, and that's more or less, strongly indicated no matter how I look at the data. And of course, because they're shadowing the banks and because the Canada Post locations are often close to banks, Canada Post is close enough to those payday lenders to be able to provide an alternative, especially at the 2,000 meter level. Now to wrap it up, so I'm sure everyone's tired. I have a few remarks on the mapping. These are things to bear in mind. So mapping, I'm a geographer. It's common to think in geography that mapping provides a lot more questions than answers. Okay, so there's not a definitive answer to be had. You have to use your imagination and think strategically about what the mapping is showing you. It would have been, at least from my point of view, a lot nicer if there were great big holes in service in inner city Toronto, or a very clear pattern of no service in certain parts of the inner suburbs of Toronto. In reality, the situation would be much more complicated. So many of the areas in the inner suburbs, which is actually more my area of expertise, so I write about suburban change in post-war Toronto, and I focus primarily in Scarborough. The land use layout means that, for instance, where there are areas of what they call tower communities in Toronto, so these are the areas where there are clusters of high-rise rental apartments that often have communities that are lower income. The geography of retail is often associated with those areas. So you often have the retail plazas in close proximity. The issue is more complicated as you move away from those intersections. So York University is located near Jane and Finch. I'm very familiar from walking around how it's laid out. If you live at the corner of Jane and Finch, you have 2 malls that service you, grocery stores, and banks. Whether those banks are interested in providing everyone in that area equal service is a different problem. But the geographic coverage is good. As you move further up Jane Street and you get closer to Steeles, there are areas where you have to walk a considerable distance, and these are areas where people don't have cars. So that in a way, that is the kind of problem that you're facing. The other thing is thinking about how local difference is obscured. So I've spoken largely about like the region as a whole. of course, when I was sitting at my computer, I was doing breakdowns of smaller areas. So the numbers look a little different if you look at just the old city of Toronto. So you would expect that the bank branches are going to be closer to each other because the area is denser, the built form is more compact. But also the social differences are also finer grained. So earlier Linda McQuaig spoke. She ran, I believe, in Toronto Centre for the NDP. This is a riding that has, condos in the south, several large public housing projects in the middle, and then one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Canada on the top. It's probably not an easy place to come up with a political pitch. But this is also typical of many parts of inner city Toronto where there are, there are either long established gentrified areas or newly gentrified areas, infill housing that has changed the income composition, and it's all happening within walking distance, a few hundred meters. So you have to factor that versus, say, a new subdivision on the outer edge of the city region, where for someone to have to drive 2 or 3 kilometers to the supermarket is not seen as abnormal. And if you talk to them about banking deserts or food deserts, and you say a certain percentage of people live more than 500 meters from a grocery store, or more than 1,000, it's not going to resonate the same way as it would if you talk to people in inner city Toronto or in tower neighborhoods in Scarborough or Rexdale. The last point might be to think this analysis was done, so much work was put into collecting the locations. When I ran the analysis, I chose to use straight line distance, so I was drawing circles in effect around locations. A more precise way of doing it would be to connect those dots to road network data and to calculate the distance based on actual travel. This would tend to show perhaps slightly less coverage than if you use the circles. And that may, in particular, apply in Newfoundland, where it's not always clear what the geographic boundaries are. So the road network is not operating in straight lines. It's moving around a lot of barriers. And then the last bit is, had it not taken so long to collect and map out the locations, there were a number of other areas that I would have pursued, such as trade area analysis. So that would be selecting out interesting locations and doing a more detailed analysis of who lives around that area and what the situation there is. And of course, the last part is simply looking at geography doesn't give you the full picture of the exclusion aspect. So financial exclusion can mean, for instance, not being comfortable going from where you are to where the bank is for a host of reasons. It could be safety. It could also be that other area, the socioeconomic difference is high enough you don't feel comfortable going to that particular branch, even though it's actually very close. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Rob. Okay, so we'll open the floor for questions. Yes, sister.
Hi, Louise Aid from Newfoundland and Labrador. I found it very interesting, and thank you for that. We just had 75 communities reduced by 25% of their postal service in the community. And just to give you an example, which will probably support your some of your points, I've talked to all of them, and of the 75, there's less than 1% that has any kind of banking institution at all, and none of them has got payday loans or any of those institutions. Just to narrow it down, I just spoke to 25 communities in the last month, and of the 25 communities, there was one community, that's all, and that had a credit union. So you're going to find your banks closer to the most populated areas, like the St. John's area, Conception Bay South, probably the Corner Brook area, Clarenville, Grand Falls, but Newfoundland and Labrador are so separated, and we have a lot of communities that in order to go to a bank, you've either got to get on a ferry or get on to Skidoo. And the remote areas, especially up on the Labrador coast, I had one postmaster tell me that we have people who come in, they work in Voisey's Bay, they come home with their check, they'll take that check to the post office, and they will have maybe 25 to 30 money orders. And they'll have the money orders made out so that they could give a money order to the grocery store, a money order to the oil man, and that's how, so they're using the post office. So when I see the way things are working in Newfoundland and Labrador, right now we have had 75 offices that are reduced in service, and we're expecting more. So we're just waiting for the next wave of reductions to hit us. So when I look at the way financial institutions work and the way it is right now in these remote areas, I see a great opportunity for banking service in those areas, because the people are looking for ways to utilize and to use the post office as a banking tool right now. So I think it's a great opportunity.
Thank you, Sister. Brother Lafleur?
Merci, George. I want to thank both speakers, both panelists. I've got a question coming out. As I said earlier, I was at the Labor Notes Conference, Jim, in Chicago a few weeks ago, and I got a copy of the Postal Union Alliance. So if you could elaborate on that and what that's all about. And the other thing is, you know, we're under attack with the door-to-door delivery. Just wondering if you're hearing echoes in the United States that the USPS might be going in that direction, or in the opposite direction, hopefully. Thanks.
Yeah, so let me talk about the alliance first. It's a complicated trade union structure in the U.S., like everything else is complicated. So we have 4 unions. We have 2 delivery unions. One for my union represents about 200,000 city carriers and work in cities and towns. We're in every state in the union. And then there's another union that has about 100,000 rural letter carriers. That happened because historically city delivery was added first and rural delivery came later, and we just had different organizations, and all our unions were formed long before we had collective bargaining rights. So they started as quite different organizations. It started out as sort of social fraternal organizations that eventually developed into collective begging organizations where we go to Congress and ask them, please give us a raise, and eventually turned into real unions with collective bargaining rights. Then we have 2, the American Postal Workers Union and the Mail Handlers Union. They represent workers on the inside. It's like similar to the old split before the CUPW was created as a merged union. And we've had our difficulties historically with philosophical differences, personality differences, for whatever reason. And we weren't always on the same page on lots of these important sort of structural and political legislative issues. I think the huge benefit there was a change in the leadership at the APWU, and I give a lot of credit to the new president, Mark Dimmenstein, for sort of reaching out and trying to break down the barriers between the unions. And we've worked over the last 6 months to really kind of work together. And this alliance came with the idea that we had to, the vision on, especially about legislative and political strategy, was just killing us. It was giving our friends an excuse to not help us, and it was helping our enemies. And so getting us sort of on the same page and coming to coalescing around a reform agenda that is a very, very targeted reform agenda has been tremendously helpful. And we're up against it. We still have a very hostile House of Representatives. And just going to the second part of your question, the day that Canada Post announced that they planned on ending door-to-door delivery, the chairman of the House Oversight Committee that manages the Postal Service, postal legislation, issued a triumphant press release saying how brilliant the Canadians were, that this is an idea he's had for the U.S. for years, and lauding Canada Post and criticizing the U.S. Postal Service for not doing the same thing. So it added fuel to him. That's a big part of his legislative proposal, would be to end business door-to-door delivery right away, immediately, and then phase out door-to-door delivery for 45 million American households over time. Now this guy, Darrell Ice, is the richest guy in the United States Congress. He's a multimillionaire. He's got a huge estate, and he prides himself in being a businessman. But it's just bewildering to us why this makes any business sense whatsoever to destroy the connection between letter carriers and their customers. That's an asset. That's not a cost. That connection, we use that relationship every day to build our business. We letter carriers have this program called Customer Connect, where letter carriers talk to the businesses they deliver to, and they say, we can provide the services that you're going to some other provider for at a much better rate. And we've built something like on the order of $2 billion in annual revenues on shipping contracts because of that. So it makes no business sense to discontinue that connection between letter carriers and their customers. And the public is dead set against it. The Postal Service has the authority right now to end door-to-door delivery. They don't do it because every time they announce it, the local community goes crazy. So we're going to be there to stoke that opposition. But they are trying. There are proposals in Congress to end door-to-door delivery and Saturday delivery. We still do 6-day delivery in the U.S. And our view is these just makes no business sense in an age of e-commerce. That in the future, doing Saturday delivery makes us unique in the delivery industry. That's going to be a positive for us. That will help us, capture more of those deliveries in the future. And that doesn't make sense, particularly since it's being driven by an artificial financial crisis because of these retiree health funding requirements. We want to repeal those requirements or solve that problem and expand service, not cut service.
Any other questions? Yes, Denis.
Just
on the question of regions.
What is happening? So you have like a conclusion saying that all the payday are overlapping the banks, so more or less. So that shows that the postal bank can be really a solution to get rid of all this payday. Can you make the assumption that it's the same thing everywhere in the country, or because it seems that the Greater Toronto, it's there. Is it something that we can build on? So that's my question for you. I have a couple of questions for Jim. Just about the issue, you just talked about the 6-day delivery. There's a lot of misinformation about the 6-day delivery, where it is in the House of the Representatives, where it is at the Senate, to have a clear idea about this situation, because that's really something important. The other point is about the fact that you talk about that 68 million Americans who are unbanked. That's the way I understand it. It's 1 out of 6. And you really point out the fees as one of the most important things. So what is your analysis? First, what is the fee? This morning we say in Canada, the administrative fee for a bank is about $185. Is it really more expensive than that in the States? And what is the impact of that, and what is the other aspect? Because 68 million people, it's 1 out of 6 American is unbanked. So just to have some information on that.
Okay, so to answer the first question, it's hard to make assumptions about other places, but based on I've seen at least one study. So there's someone that writes out of Winnipeg quite extensively about financial exclusion in Canada. And it's pretty clear in their findings that they found very similar things there, that the banks tended to the payday lenders tended to shadow the banks. One of the difficulties is, you'd have to think, well, if there was a large, if you had a large amount of banking desert, say in Toronto, would the payday lenders go into that area without the banks? And I can't answer that, but my assumption would be they don't have to, because the banking network is fairly dense in Toronto. kind of can speak a bit about it in Hamilton, where there's a little bit more of a hole in the service in the middle of the lower city. And even there, the payday lenders, you know, might be a little bit further into that hole, but they're still not far from the banks that are on the outer edges. But speaking to sort of Calgary or Edmonton or Vancouver is a bit beyond. I've never looked at the numbers. Oh, someone in the back.
Yeah, Jeff?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go
So
ahead.
Denis, you had two questions. The situation with 6-day delivery. In the U.S., it's not in the permanent law that requires 6-day delivery. There's an annual appropriation that the Postal Service gets to pay for overseas election voting, diplomats, soldiers, and the Postal Service gets this tiny little taxpayer subsidy to pay for that because they get to vote. The mailing costs are free. As a condition of getting that appropriation, Congress mandates that the Postal Service provide six-day-a-week delivery. The history of it was, at some point, the Postal Service, they've been wanting to get rid of 6-day delivery for literally 50 years. And back in the early 80s, they announced they were going to do it. And Congress responded by putting this rider, they call it, on this appropriations bill, saying, no, you may not. As a condition of this money we're giving you, you have to provide 6-day delivery. So every year we have to fight to renew that rider, and we do. We've done it like 12 times in the last 4 years because they keep doing these short-term funding bills. And so we have to win that battle all the time because the Postal Service, left to their own devices, they would cut it. So both the House and the Senate have bills before Congress that would eliminate Saturday delivery because the Postal Service is just saying they need this to survive. We've shown over time through the Postal Regulatory Commission that their estimates of savings are way off. They said they could save $3.8 billion a year by getting rid of Saturday delivery. Through that regulatory process, we showed that the savings were closer to $1.7 billion, and if they actually looked at what the negative impact on revenue would be from business that they'll lose, because a third of their own market research shows a third of the business mailers in the country want Saturday delivery. Well, if you lose those, you're going to lose the revenue. So we think at the end of the day, it would actually hurt the business. They'd probably lose more revenue than the cost savings. But we've sort of had to fight this out. The Postal Service, the management of the Postal Service is dead set on this plan to get rid of it. And they've gotten support on both houses of Congress and frankly from the President Obama in his budgets. So we've been up against the wall for the last 5 years on this. Fortunately, in the Congress, we have tremendous support. We have a majority of the Congress supports keeping Saturday delivery because it's popular with the country. And we just think in business terms, thinking not, we try to get Congress to think not legislating now, but where we're going to be in 10 or 20 years, and how much of the e-commerce market can we get, how much, we've actually started doing deliveries on Sunday, the Postal Service doing Sunday deliveries for Amazon. It's wildly popular. We went from starting the first weekend it was announced, we did 40,000 packages. 8 weeks later, we were doing 4 million on Sunday. So we want every retailer in the country to think about, and frankly, not just the big retailers, the small mom and pop who have to compete with the big retailers. We want local businesses, small businesses to offer the convenience of having something delivered the next day through the post office, and we have the network to do it. Amazon and a lot of these companies, they go to UPS and FedEx and ask to do it with them first. But they end up saying, go to the post office, they have the better network. We have, this unbelievable network is a real asset. So we're trying, who's going to take business advice from labor unions? This is our problem. Congress is sort of listening to the management of the Postal Service and not to the workers. On the second issue about the 68 million Americans, I just want to be clear. 68 million who are unbanked or underbanked. So unbanked is a smaller number where they have no account or anything. Underbanked refers to the fact that people they'll have a savings account, but they don't go and do business with that bank where they have the savings account. They go to the payday lenders, they go to the car title loan outfits or the check cashing operations because the fees that the banks charge are so expensive. And one that really hurts low-income workers is that they often get huge penalty fees if they bounce a check. So if you're really struggling to make ends meet and you're a working person and you got to pay your bills and you have an unexpected car loan, a car repair or something, and you send out your checks and they're already out, what banks were doing for years, this is now illegal thanks to Senator Warren, she's got some reforms on, what they used to do is they would purposely cash your largest check so that all your other little checks would bounce. You know, they'd cash your, you know, and then they would charge you $50 for every check you bounce. So that's what pushes people away from using banks, and then they end up even in worse circumstances. They're going to the payday lender to kind of make up, you know, for their shortfall that month. And this is where the post office, you know, at a very reasonable terms in a safe way that wouldn't risk anything, any of the taxpayer money or postal service money could fill that void at a much lower cost. And that's where we think, you know, our postal network can really solve that problem. Yeah.
Thanks, Jim. Brother Bickerton? Yes, Jeff?
Jeff Bickerton, I'm with the CUPW. Not the CWU. Sorry, brother.
Wishful thinking, Jeff.
Yes.
I have a comment.
It was a successful
about,
trip, Andy. You recruited
Rob's
another member.
presentation and, a question about chips. I guess my comment about Rob's presentation is, I think this has really helped us understand. I think the visual sort of explanation of the situation really illuminates a lot for us. It's one thing to say, you know, there's 200 and some banks in 200 and some communities in Newfoundland that have a post office and no bank. But when you see it and you realize how far some of these communities are away from any bank. You know, as the sister mentioned, it can be a ferry ride or a skidoo ride. It could be a long ferry ride and it can be a long skidoo ride. And that you really only see that when you see it mapped out the way you've done. And on the flip side, on the urban areas, I think, you know, what really jumps out at us is the payday loan. You know, the concentration of these payday loan operations, and realizing it's not geography in the urban areas. It's the payday loan places represent the failure of the banks to provide services to an ever-increasing part of the population, lower income people, Aboriginal people, etc. And I'm not even sure if it's a failure of the banks or a deliberate strategy of the banks to make sure that they don't have to undergo the cost of these accounts versus wealthier people's accounts. So I think that it has really helped our thinking about what we have to do. Jim, my question for you is, you know, Andy talked about in Britain, they have a coalition. You know, a coalition, various organizations working together in terms of the People's Bank Coalition. You said that you're working with other organizations. Have you considered sort of the establishment of a sort of formalized coalition?
It's funny you mentioned that because there, as sort of an offshoot of the Public Banking Institute, there's this new NGO that's just been formed called Bank Act, which I think is intended to serve as sort of the lead of building a coalition like that. Our presidents are meeting with the executive director of that organization in the next week or two. Our intention is to try to build is to reach out to progressive organizations that work on these issues, you know, far beyond the labor movement. I think there is a broad coalition of people that we can draw on, and the Public Banking Institute was just something new for us. We joined, we became a supporter last year, and it's really eye-opening. It's amazing how many different organizations have really great ideas, and what their conferences allowed everyone to find out what each other is doing, and our hope is to get them, and certainly Bank Act, one of their first, you know, they're pushing public banks at the state level, but they've endorsed a postal bank solution at the federal level, and we think we should, you know, I think that it's a very promising start, and we have a lot of work to do. Yeah.
Okay. Nicolas.
Oui, c'est juste une question.
I just have a question. Are there any Is there any capitalistic connections between the banks and the usurious organizations, the payday loan organizations? Are there any connections or linkages there?
That'd be a great thing to study. I'm sure there are. I mean, when we have these in these public forums that we often participate, we were just involved one at Rutgers in Washington, and a lot of the folks from the academics and people who are from the finance industry sort of question the Postal Service's ability to have the sophistication to do, to manage risk and have the financial resources to do it. And it struck me as odd that these storefront operators, there's nothing sophisticated about it. They're ripping people off, and it's not hard. We have, the Postal Service has tremendous cash flow, and could manage these risks very easily, and there are easy ways to do it. And I think the reason that a lot of these, especially they have a very prominent trade association, the payday lenders, they all have relationships with banks. That's where they get their lending. The banks kind of keep their distance because it's not considered socially acceptable, but they clearly have financial arrangements where they back these payday lenders, and so it's going to be a real challenge to fight them off. The public is totally behind us, though, because everyone sees it for what it is. It's exploitation.
Denis?
No, just sur la question.
Just on Nicolas' question, tomorrow we're going to be hearing a presentation from people who are running a campaign to see what kind of connections exist between banks and these types of organizations. It's called Making Waves. So during tomorrow's plenary, we will be addressing that specific issue.
At this point, actually, I need to apologize to our internet participant, Alan Blaines, where I attempted to paraphrase a point he was trying to make by converting it into a question. So I'd like to perhaps clarify the point. And what the point he's trying to bring forward to the group here is that what's happened with the censoring of the 701 pages of the banking study is an example of governance by fraud. It is reminiscent of the actions of Michael Ignatieff to lampoon the shamelessness of Harper rather than looking at the indefensibility of Harper's position. We need a policy of focusing intense scrutiny on the Harper actions and waiting for every response that the Harperites come up with and demolishing their phony policy positions. And we could actively get international condemnation of the suppression of the Canada Post study, and this may start to get the robotic con MPs to examine the facts and then possibly begin to assert good faith governance. And he thanks us for conducting this symposium and hoping that we will develop a national and international strategy to challenge the falsity of the Harper position. So, are there any other questions from the floor? Denis?
Just one point on that, because Jim touched on a very important point when he said we have the support and moral support and sympathy of the public. So we have a huge challenge in terms of transforming that sympathy and that moral support into concrete action and political action. And we have that responsibility. It's not necessarily easy to accomplish. When you meet with people, or when you talk to MPs from the NDP, and we've sent letters to people's homes, what comes back is that everybody agrees that postal services should be protected. Everybody agrees that banking services could be a very attractive avenue. But how do we change that into a political force? And I think that is something we have to look at, what we're seeing in the U.S. and Canada. We really have to look at how we can turn that into action. through a coalition possibly, but what kind of coalition? Who should be part of that coalition? What kind of form should it take in order to bring political pressure to bear on the government that will be effective and efficient and yield concrete results? So that is one of the challenges that we see through that large public support, that wide public support.
Thanks to Mark Armstrong, another internet participant who's given some information here in respect of Wells Fargo and the Bank of America. And up until recently, these two Wall Street banks were the largest provider of funding for payday lenders. So, Linda. Micro, s'il vous plaît.
Yeah, I'm intrigued by the idea that some of the unbanked or underbanked would willingly go to a payday lender rather than a bank that's nearby. Are you suggesting that they would be better off or almost as equally bad off between the two of them?
Yeah, I'm not saying that they willingly go to the payday lender. I'm saying that the banks won't give small-scale personal loans to a low-wage worker. They're not interested in doing that business. It's not worth it to them. And so the fact is the banks aren't required. Even if you have a job, if you're a low-wage worker and you can demonstrate you're employed and you can pay the loan, they don't have to give you that loan, and so they won't. And so what happens is, even though person may have a small savings in a bank, they end up going to the payday lender because the bank won't loan to them, won't lend to them, and there's no social requirement to do it.
But were you also suggesting that sometimes they'll get such bad treatment with checks bouncing and that kind of thing that they actually might end up being so financially poorly off, even if the bank would deal with them, that they might be just...
Yeah, I think and a lot of it is just that you have such a bad experience with banks like that when you hit with these overdraft fees and the kind of penalties. And the fact is that for most banks in the U.S., you have to get free checking, quote unquote, with no fees, you have to have $2,000 or $3,000. And then if you don't maintain that kind of balance, the monthly fees on the checking can be so high that it wipes out any interest that you get paid. Interest rates are at an all-time low. So basically, most people you end up almost paying the bank to hold your money. And that's just horrible. And so a lot of times people make really bad decisions going to these payday lenders because they feel like they have nowhere else to go. They have a crisis, they got a bill to pay, they got to keep the heat on, and they end up worse off down the line.
So I mean, another wonderful aspect of postal banking potentially isn't just even the locations, but just getting decent fees and rates, right?
Yeah, and it kind of goes to one of the points I made, and Rob and I were talking about before we were up here, is that financial exclusion is not exclusively a geographical concept. It's a financial concept. It's an affordability concept.
Any other questions from the floor? Well, thank you very much, brothers, for your presentation.
Before you go?
Oh, okay. Thank you, George. I'll add it to my collection.
Well, it's been a very interesting afternoon, and a lot of very good information to help us in preparing and going forward with a program to try and force Canada Post and this government to seriously undertake postal banking and implement it for the population of Canada and Quebec. And I think tomorrow we will be investigating further with more panelists and more discussion. And I thank you very much for your participation today. And while we're adjourning a little early, that's I think we've had to absorb a whole lot of information, and we'll have the evening now to think about it and perhaps come forward with some more questions tomorrow. So have a good evening, and thank you very much.